I had an early start because I had to be at the BBC by 9, which is a bit of if you come from Kent, is a bit of a pain.
What were you doing at the BBC?
It was an interview on humour and advertising with Ewan Davis for The Bottom Line.
Oh, nice.
And it was great, actually. It was with Lucy Greaves, who wrote the book with Jimmy Carr on The Naked Jape, which is a kind of interesting inquiry into the value of humour.
I've read part of that. I've read the Jimmy Carr, his sort of autobiography, Life.
Oh, I haven't read that one. Is that good? I once interviewed him on stage. It's fascinating because, if you work in advertising and you've been doing it for 20 years, you're quite good on your feet.
Yeah.
Right. But then when you actually do a live interview with a professional comedian, it's rather like getting into a Formula One car, having driven ordinary family saloons for the rest of your life, the past life, because the speed of what's sometimes called brain to mouth, the speed of response and the rapidity with which, in other words, there's that slight feeling that, everything is like 10 times more responsive and quicker than you're used to. And it's freakish, absolutely freakish.
I did my first live podcast last week in front of an audience for about 150 people.
Oh, brilliant.
At a food, it's like a bread and jam. It's like a specifically for Chandler food and drink brands. It's really good. Like they had Charlie Bigham there.
Oh, brilliant. The Charlie Bigham.
Yeah, the Charlie Bigham. He's been on this podcast actually, but that was like right when I started, when it was like I'd actually like to do him again. Now I've done it. But they had him. They had a guy called Giles Brooke who did like Innocent, Vita Coco, like loads of brands.
Oh, yeah.
But it was...
Sorry, he created Vita Coco as well as Innocent?
No, so what did he do? He was the general manager at Innocent, took that to a big level.
Got it.
Then came in and did EMEA for Vita Coco. Then he did Bear... I know you've got kids, they may probably be a bit past your kids. He did Bear Snacks. Mm-hmm. Did those. So he built and sold that to those biscuits.
I know those, remember
but
those.
I did one with him, and I was like, this is actually fucking crazy. Like, you've got those people looking at you, and you're like, this is. But you're so right. I feel like the reaction from not hand to mouth, from brain to mouth.
Yeah.
When the adrenaline and the fear is like ramped up, you just seem sharper. I don't know what it is. There's something about being in that kind of hype, like pressure cooker environment, that makes you sharper. I don't know why.
No, you're right. And actually, the filmed in front of a studio audience, there's kind of a reason for it. There's something about the feedback from the live audience which makes presenting to a live audience one of the things. I mean, I had an advantage when the pandemic happened because I had actually, I had done quite a bit of radio work. And so speaking into a microphone didn't seem that weird. Mm-hmm. Whereas I know to a lot of people, of course, if it's your first ever experience of it during the pandemic, where you're basically talking into space, it takes, a good 6 hours practice before it stops feeling weird. But so having the live audience undoubtedly, and the feedback, when something's funny, they laugh, when it's amazing, they go, ooh, that sort of thing undoubtedly sort of hastens the sort of pace of the whole thing a bit, I think.
We'll save it for when we hit the record, which we'll do in a sec, but I want to talk about that in terms of like comedy and brands, because I think humour in brands, I think, is people becoming too scared to put humour in brands.
Yes, I think that one of the problems with purpose is it tended to make too many brands too serious.
So true.
And I don't want to live in a world where everything is trying to save the world. Because let's face it, we won't save the world one brand at a time. It will require huge amounts of cooperation and indeed, in some cases, legislation, perhaps. But, this idea that, every brand should be effectively seeking to occupy the highest moral ground it possibly can doesn't strike me as fundamentally sustainable as, it's one of those things that's cute when the first 10 brands do it. And in the case of some brands, Dove, for example, it was entirely appropriate to what Dove is as a brand, okay? It's sort of beauty without artifice, as I think the phrase went. But if it ends up with, your sausage rolls effectively, talking about the migrant crisis, things have gone too far.
I've always thought about like, you know, have you heard of Mr. Beast?
Yes.
The YouTuber who's got that chocolate bar brand. I've always thought, why isn't a comedian like almost reinventing the penguin, right? You know, the penguin chocolate bar.
What happened? You can still buy them, can you?
You can still buy them, but sorry, like nothing happened to them. But you know, you had like a joke in there, right?
Yeah.
I think in today's society, it's so like as you said, like all these purpose brands, and I think it's amazing, absolutely amazing. But I do think there's a slight space for
well, humour, apart from anything else, just adds value to communication. So if you can make communication both pertinent, meaningful, persuasive, and funny, why wouldn't you do that? Apart from anything else, of course, you know, the very best humour bears repetition. That's another point, which is saying the same thing. You know, I mean, in fact, quite a lot of humour sort of relies on repetition to a degree. You know, if you take programmes like The Fast Show,
yeah,
you know, what was interesting about the first Heineken ad in the classic 1970s advertising campaign wasn't actually very funny. It wasn't very good. But what it is, it established the format, almost the catch, the punchline and the format of the joke. And then every subsequent ad was a riff on that. And in the same way, you know, if you remember The Fast Show, you know, the first instance of Jesse's diet, where Jesse walks out of the shed and goes, "This week I've mostly been eating pimentos," okay? It's a completely baffling and nonsensical thing. But by the time you've done it 47 times and then you flip it so that it's Jesse's fashion and he goes, "This week I shall be mostly wearing Dolce & Gabbana," right? Okay, then you know, you've really taken it and you've imbued it with something fabulous and it's something you own. And, you know, I mean, I think you know, one of the sad things in advertising. One of the sad things in advertising is we don't have those long-running campaigns which are, you know, variations on a theme to the same extent.
Yeah, is the Fast Show the one when it's the two builders who are speaking really posh, and then when a woman comes past, they start speaking, hello mate, hello mate.
And pals. But you're absolutely right. There's one where they're discussing a Radio 3 broadcast of something.
Yeah.
And then as soon as a woman walked past, they just suddenly cut to yelling general sexist abuse and then revert as soon as she's gone past. Yeah,
I really do think, I mean, they're playing, this is like blue sky thing, but I love The Office. I think it's the funniest program ever. Like if they were to create some sort of, it's got such a diehard following. If they were to create an actual product out of that,
Wernham Hogg,
like if you just had David Brent one-liners. So back to the penguin thing, like you know the whole penguin thing. You opened it up and you had a little shitty joke in there. Do you remember that about the penguin files?
I always wondered why. I mean, there are a lot of properties. Given that we've now seen a movie made out of Barbie, there are a lot of properties out there. I never quite understood why the owners of the James Bond franchise didn't create a kind of adult theme park around it.
Yeah, and it's the same. It's like all these comedians have the following, and they have the.
You could definitely create a Vegas casino around Bond, couldn't you? The 007 and the Vegas Strip. That would definitely work.
Yeah, it's so weird. So the amount of ideas that just don't come. That just seem so obvious. And it's.
I suppose the brand's been a sort of famous legal minefield for some time, and you may. A lawyer may tell me that I'm being absolutely stupid because, you know, you need the permission of the estate of this and the so-and-so's that and cubby broccolis, this and that and the other. But I know that, I mean, one of the most interesting facets of brands that makes them valuable is their power to spawn kind of, you know, oblique spin-offs. I know, as someone said, you don't necessarily have to have a brand extension. You can also have a brand bounce. I mean, you know, an extraordinary case of brand bounce was Caterpillar, where, you know, the entry-level Caterpillar device was probably $500,000, and then they went into workwear and boots.
Wait, so sorry, what's the difference?
JCB has done the same.
Yeah, but brand bounce, what does that mean?
A brand extension is where you go from, you know, one flavour variant.
Right, okay, yeah.
Or you produce a light variant, okay? Yeah. That's where you're basically staying within your tram lines, you're staying within the category. Brand bounce is where you go into a completely different category and use your brand effectively as instant credentials to operate in that category. So Caterpillar, someone who makes, you know, $20 million earth moving equipment, patently knows a thing or two about, workwear or boots or whatever it may be. And therefore, almost from day one, bizarrely, they can operate with far more credibility in that category than a newcomer could.
We should probably just jump in because there's stuff I can talk about on that as well.
Well, particularly in food as well, which is interesting.
But it's like that, I listened to a podcast you did where you talked about that Algorithms to Live By book.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book.
And I tried to get my head around it, but I was like, this is a bit too mathematical for my liking. But his whole thing of explore versus exploit.
Yeah.
So that's a great example of Caterpillar where they've exploited in like machinery, but then they've actually had the nice balance of explore and gone into hardware or wearable stuff.
It might have been someone licensed their brand.
True.
Obviously that happened with people like Vidal Sassoon and so forth. It was P&G who went along and realised that Vidal Sassoon, who I met once, an absolutely delightful, fabulous man, by the way. Vidal Sassoon, he was a very famous hairdresser of the probably 60s, 70s, 80s. And he was the Tonian guy of the 1980s. But Vidal Sassoon, somebody spotted the fact that he had fame which went way beyond his capacity to exploit it within his particular field of men's and women's, essentially, hairdressing. Okay? And so presumably it was Procter & Gamble who just went along and said, we'll pay you some money if we can call a brand of premium shampoos Vidal Sassoon, which is exactly what they did. I don't know whether Caterpillar was a decision by Caterpillar itself or whether it was licensed. I've got a vague memory. It might have been the former. But it's just a very interesting thing to do. I think Ogilvy should do it as a brand because we have probably more, worldwide, we probably have more prompted and unprompted name recognition than any other agency, partly because David was brilliant at publicising things. And to me, it seems a bit silly to waste that. There are areas like, for example, e-learning we could get into, which other agencies couldn't. So why wouldn't you?
Have you got a podcast?
I host one.
I know you host one, but
I don't have one of my own.
Specifically.
And we have a very interesting one historically called Oh Behave, which is the behavioural science podcast,
right?
Which we did for a long time with an Ogilvy. We're quite early to it, actually. I'm a fan. What I don't understand is why no one's produced a TV programme, The Best of the Week's podcasts. Or, actually, or a radio programme would be perfectly adequate in some cases, not all. But it seems kind of weird to me that there isn't a kind of podcast, because you have genuinely an extraordinarily high quality, the quality isn't perfect, but the quality-quantity factor is extraordinary, actually.
Quality, quantity.
I'm astonished, repeatedly astonished now. And I think one of the things I like to talk about a lot is YouTube, because I think we always spend time talking about what's next, okay? And we spend too little time talking about what's changed. Now, video conferencing is a very old technology, but what's changed, if I go and say, I've got a really important technology I want to talk to you about, it's video conferencing. They go, well, Skype existed in 1997. Yep, true. But what's changed is that the pandemic gave the whole world a crash course in using it. And secondly, the pandemic normalized it so that if I said to a client, is it okay if I meet you on Zoom because otherwise it'll take 10 days? In 2017, that might have seemed a bit weird. It doesn't seem weird now. So what's changed as opposed to what's new is a really important question. And YouTube fascinates me because I think it will reach a kind of, I was going to say, the singularity, where there's so much content on there that it becomes video Wikipedia. In other words, most of the time we kind of browse it, we watch it, we go down a rabbit hole. But I think it'll reach a point where actually you can go online and say, I want to know about the Peloponnesian Wars. And then, to your astonishment, you will discover that someone has made, effectively, a 40-minute broadcast quality programme about the Peloponnesian Wars or something similar. Now, the budget isn't going to be as, it's not going to be in Game of Thrones, right? But what's so interesting is that I only in the last 5 years have I started watching YouTube on my TV, and I tended to think of it unfairly as something which was a bit pixelated, shot in a handheld camera, best consumed on a kind of small screen or small device. And then I suddenly discovered that actually on my 55-inch, most of it's in 4K, it's always in HD. It's effectively indistinguishable in terms of picture quality from watching TV. Now, okay, getting excited about YouTube feels weird because YouTube is really, 12 years old, 13 years old?
2005, yeah.
Okay, it's as old as that, is it? Yeah, good,
Yeah.
2005. But actually, the significance of it is changing as both, first of all, the quality of, one, the public's videography skills improve. Two, the equipment they have to use becomes, not quite indistinguishable from professional camera work, but as near as damn it. And thirdly, just the volume of content becomes so extraordinary that you would go there by default to unblock a drain, solve an IT problem you're having with your laptop upgrading, whatever it may be.
I really struggle to sit down and watch a TV series. I just don't have the patience for it. But I can go down a YouTube rabbit hole. I ended up watching a video. Have you heard of the restaurant Fallow in St. James?
No, I haven't.
I'm going there on Thursday. But there's basically a chef, right? And it's the most fascinating half-an-hour video. He's got a camera switched on here on his chest.
And he's just going about his day.
No, it's in the middle of service, in a high-pressure service. And it's like the most fascinating thing to watch. So I ended up watching that for Well,
there's something really odd, which is that I think one of the things we've discovered in both podcasts and in that certainly for the most curious 20% of the population, it's worth noting that a lot of people aren't that curious. I mean, we ought to caveat that.
Yeah.
But for the curious 20% of the population, there are far more things that are actually interesting than we ever anticipated. So my daughter was just watching that series, The Bear, on Disney, funnily enough, about a Chicago restaurant. And you realise that the inner workings of a restaurant, if you are curious, are actually extraordinarily interesting. There's a wonderful thing on YouTube, which is Ask a Mortician is the channel. And it's a woman who is, unsurprisingly, a mortician.
A mortician.
Which is a funeral director. It is American for funeral director, basically someone who, deals with stiffs. And she does this whole description of the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination seen from the point of view of a funeral director. And it is absolutely fascinating, because of course they weren't expecting to have to buy a coffin that day when they arrived, where they went, which funeral home they went to. The fact that the FBI, I think, basically commandeered the hearse to take the body to Love Field and had no idea how to detach the coffin from the back of the hearse. So, because they hadn't brought anybody from the...
This is true, right?
This is all true.
It's all true.
It's all true. Now, here you have what is the most over-digested, 8 hours of 20th century history. I mean, every single second of the period around the Kennedy assassination has been studied to death. But you just take it and have this completely different perspective, which is what does it look like when looked at through the lens of a mortician rather than a conspiracy theorist or whatever. And you suddenly realise that there's a whole extra dimension that appears.
All right, just move your chair.
Of course,
that way, yes.
Just through adopting this sort of slightly weird point of view. And it's I can't remember, 40, 50 minutes. It's among the most sort of captivating 40 minutes of TV.
I think it allows you to look at things subconsciously through the wrong way. James Dyson's got a quote I love, which is, view the problem from the wrong way round, I think it is. I've bastardised that.
Yeah, I mean, Conan Doyle in the mouthpiece of Sherlock Holmes talks about thinking backward.
Yeah, and what YouTube does is I've gone down this rabbit hole last night. This was literally last night. So I'm watching some guy in the middle of a service at a restaurant. You don't think the amount of times I've watched programs with, Anthony Bourdain or Gordon Ramsay, and it's almost objective journalism, right? So
yes.
But this is kind of more like almost gonzo journalism, whereby the guy's got a fucking iPhone here, and you can see him going, "I need that food there." And so I was watching that for hours, and then I ended up watching.
Is it live or is it?
It's not live. I'll send you the links to much.
Oh, fantastic!
But it's just really interesting to watch.
It doesn't have to be live in that case.
No, and it's just it just makes you, you see restaurant from a completely new angle. Then I watched a video of these YouTubers called Jolly, who they go around, and it's just a weird kind of human experience. They give American kids like tea and biscuits and watch their reactions, and they give English kids, they're probably like 15,
Milk
16
and cookies and all.
Well, no, they give English kids Popeyes, which is their equivalent of KFC.
Oh, I see.
And you watch that for but it's a great, interesting lens into just humans and how fucking bizarre we are.
No, I'm always fascinated by food on the grounds that there are certainly some foods which, without their provenance, would have gone nowhere. So the example I quote in my book is miso soup.
Yeah.
Miso soup didn't exist, and your friend or son or daughter or whatever said, "Hey, Dad, I've invented a new soup." Okay, you go and try it, and you'd be highly suspicious and probably go, "Don't give up the day job," you know. And so, I have to admit, I'm not sure about sushi. Now, I eat sushi, I quite enjoy it. Is it intrinsically all that good? By which I mean, if you were told that if sushi didn't exist and you were told that there was a Somalian tribe or a tribe up the Amazon who are reduced to eating bits of raw fish wrapped in rice, your natural reaction would be, poor things, I hope that never happens to me, right? With a leaf around it. And I'm never, without that kind of provenance, history, knowledge of its, widespread popularity, would people really like it? I have no idea. To what extent are we actually eating what we eat? And to what extent are we kind of consuming stories?
It's 100% that. My mate's got a business in Kennington, literally on that road going up to London Bridge. And his dad basically brought sushi to the UK as a fishing, but it's the most genius business idea because you don't pay VAT on raw fish, right? It is essentially the actual amount of fish per roll is bugger all. It's wrapped in rice, which costs bugger all. The fact it's in a thing that looks artistic and there's a premium story behind it.
And it comes from a highly advanced country which we perceive to be rich.
Yeah, it prints. He makes ridiculous margin. He just sells that into Canary Wharf, into the big banks, platters of the stuff. Super small unit, but great margin. But I think you're so right. It's like all these things. If you were to tell people sushi was from, I don't know, a cafe in Salford, you'd be like,
they've started selling raw fish. What sort of nonsense is this? And all sorts of things. Whether French cheeses or whatever, would they succeed without the what you might call the wrapper of marketing hype bullshit?
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong, it patently contributes to our enjoyment of those things, so it'd be absolutely foolish to turn your back on opportunities to make food more enjoyable through association. And we got no choice because that's how we perceive the world anyway. But it's nonetheless kind of interesting. Famously, I think there was an expert in the world caviar trade who said, look, if it cost £3.25, no one will buy it. It's scarcity. But of course, that's interesting because like champagne, for example, its real function is to mark an occasion or demonstrate hospitality or generosity or thanks or gratitude. And in order to do that, it has to be expensive. So, one of the most, I think, astute marketing moves was, I think, the rescue of British sparkling wine from being completely underrated by dint of probably the man at Chapeldown, but we can debate who it was, basically improving quality. And it's not purely a marketing thing, but also ramping the price up to kind of champagne levels of £25 and above, which then means that because I would argue that it is as good as, often better than, many champagnes, okay? And the soil's the same, after all, to a degree. And what's so interesting about that is that it doesn't matter how good the drink is. If people think you've bought it for $8.99, it's not doing the job of saying thank you, well done, happy birthday, happy wedding anniversary, congratulations on your wedding, which champagne does and can only do because you can't buy it for $7.99.
It's I think we
I wonder if there were a champagne house that started marketing champagne for $7.99, would the other champagne houses actually hire a hit, do you reckon? Do you think they basically go around and get the guy iced?
it's I suppose the analogous kind of thing to that is those brands that go into Aldi and they'll have a few SKUs in Sainsbury's and they'll actually create a sub brand for Aldi.
Yes.
But it's like, it's the same thing. So you're like, oh, it's instead of Wotsits, it's Totsits, whatever it's like. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's like, it's interesting. Right. How do you do that? How long have you got a dead pause at 4?
I've got a dead pause at 4:30. I think.
Okay, cool. Just because conscious of time, so there's so much. I mean, we can probably both talk.
I mean, you should definitely interview Justin Fattorini. Who was the Channel 5 wine guy, but he's both a brilliant. He combines an extraordinary knowledge of wine with an extraordinary knowledge of wine psychology. And wine psychology is very interesting because, one thing that always amuses me is, people like economists bragging about expensive bottles of wine. Now, you have to acknowledge, don't get me wrong, okay, a £30 bottle of wine is probably going to be appreciably better, although we can debate that. Certainly is appreciably better if you know it costs £30, okay, than a £15 bottle of wine, than a £5 bottle of wine. But you undoubtedly hit a kind of law of diminishing returns here, right? And so bragging about how much extra you can pay for what is a relatively nugatory difference in quality of the actual drink is more likely to be an example of what Freud called the narcissism of small differences than it is to be about anything to do with what you might call the price-utility function, And so, food's very, very interesting. Precisely because, one mystery is people probably don't eat as much ice cream as they'd like to. Everybody likes ice cream, okay? I know one or two people who don't, but it's vanishingly rare. It's a bit like not liking pizza, okay?
But it's like the flip side of that. So you've got the story that makes it sound so good, right? Like lobster used to be for peasants, I think. I've read somewhere. But then you've got the other places like...
I can give you a better... you're absolutely right. There were parts of... I think certainly Scotland and the United States, where they advertised we don't serve lobster more than 3 times a week. And you would get a job in both Scotland and I think possibly near the Wye Valley in Wales. If you were employed as a servant in a country house, one of your contractual conditions might be you not be expected to eat salmon more than 3 times a week. Because it was basically, being pulled out of the river. You didn't have a worldwide market for it at that point. Mm-hmm. And so if you lived near a source of salmon, oysters, lobster, they were basically, very, very cheap. New York was partly built on the back of hugely abundant oyster beds in the surrounding waters, I think.
But it's almost, you want some places to almost counter-signal, like, we look a bit shit and that's why we're good. So, I actually think it's really good. So there's a place in Manchester, which I went to uni there, the names escape me. And it's basically, their whole thing was 3 for £5, right? You go in, it's a canteen, you get 3 curries for £5. And because it looks like an absolute shithole, right?
Yep.
You walk in, and because it looks a bit gruggy, it makes you think it tastes better, right? And the same with, Brick Lane Bagel. Have you been there?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Not Brick Lane Bagel, but the bagel shop on Brick Lane.
The 24-hour one. Yeah.
But because that looks a bit... like naff, and because the service is a bit what's the word, obtuse, right? They're like get the sandwich and bugger off.
What's the one called the kebab house on the Mile End Road as well, which is a fantastic Indian restaurant. Again, there is a certain sort of formula where a classic one would be not accepting credit cards, okay?
Yeah.
There's a certain, and so you can play these interesting games, which I find really interesting. So, tablecloth or no tablecloth, really interesting question. Making people share tables, which is a Wagamama thing. Now, some of those things are kind of games because in the same way that low-cost airlines made a lot of noise about you don't get a meal, you don't get any checked-in luggage. In the early days, you didn't get allocated seats. They backed off on that because families need to sit together, and it was kind of stupid. But those things don't actually save them all that much money, okay? what saves a low-cost airline money is that, one, the pension provision for the pilots and staff is much lower than it is on a legacy airline. Two, they fly very, very late into the day and very early in the morning, so they really sweat their assets in terms of the planes. You know, typically the last BA flight back from somewhere will be 7:20, and the last EasyJet flight is kind of, midnight 30, okay? And most of their cost savings come through operational efficiencies. But you can be too cheap because the consumer goes, I don't get this. Why are you so cheap? Okay. If you say we're just as good as British Airways, but we're half the price, people go, ooh, I don't really trust this. Yeah. So what you do is you make these visible, symbolic kind of economies. And then people go, oh, I get it. I'm not paying for the fancy meal, and I'm not paying for the checked-in luggage, and, I'm not getting, a lounge or anything like that, okay? I get it. So you call yourself not a cheap airline, but a no-frills airline. And then it becomes kind of a choice, not a compromise, and we look at it completely differently. And similarly, if you had a really cheap curry house which was actually decorated expensively, it would kind of create cognitive dissonance. We wouldn't be able to make sense of it. Wagamama does the thing where everybody sits along one table, that kind of thing. Now, there's also something in food which is, okay, if anybody wants to nick this idea, they're welcome to, but I've always thought there's a business to be made, okay? Basically, opening a cafe that's called Bacon Sandwich, and you call yourself something to do with bacon sandwiches, and you only sell bacon sandwiches, you'd have a choice of bacon and bread to a degree, okay? Right?
Yeah.
And then everybody assumes because you only do that one thing, you've got to be really damn good at it.
There's a place in East London called Nettle Market called Pockets, right? And this place I've never seen. So it's in this food market where it's got like pies, it's got it's got a whole smorgasbord of different like independents. I queued 45 minutes for this place, right? They're so clever. They open from 12 till 3.
Got it.
They do a falafel wrap. That's just the one thing they do, i.e. a pocket. So but everything's made. So it's got like obviously gorgeous like steaming
bit of tahini.
Then like this sort of earth scorching hot like chili sauce in there, aubergine, fresh falafel that crispy but fluffy in the middle. And my God, it's one of the best things you'll ever eat. It's about £5. But that is your bacon sandwich, right? So they just do that one thing.
And what they've also done, they've done the perverse thing in terms of opening hours.
Yeah.
Which is the logical thing is open as late as you possibly can, keep selling these things, for as long as you can. And the perverse thing I do with bacon sandwich, okay, if I opened it, you could have a roll, you could have a baguette, you could have crispier or softer bacon, but that's it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The two drinks I'd offer would be Builder's tea and champagne. Nothing else, okay? You just have those two, okay?
Yeah.
And then finally, I'd do a really perverse thing, which is I'd have brown sauce, but I wouldn't allow ketchup, okay? And I'd just do that as a gratuitous perversity. Exactly like the opening hours thing. And I can't explain entirely where the psychology works there, but there's an interesting one, which is when Five Guys started, they went to a chain of 3. It's something like 110 years old or 105 years old. There are 3 chip shops. I'm going to call them chip shops, not fry shops, because actually the fries they sell. Well, it's in America. I think it's in Ocean City, Maryland. It's called, if I'm right, Threshers. Might be called Thrashers. Okay. Five Guys went there and basically said, okay, where do you get your potatoes? How do you cook them? The Five Guys fries are modelled on these fries. Okay. And they sell them, I'm pretty sure they only sell fries in a cone, okay? They've been going for about 100 years. They're utterly kind of, mobbed when they're open. And here's the really weird thing, okay? They don't provide ketchup or mayonnaise. They only provide salt or vinegar. Now, okay, in the UK, that would be a bit weird, but it's not totally. In the US, that's completely whack, right? Because, it's a ketchup, not a vinegar culture, undoubtedly. All right. And yet they'll let you salt your fries, they'll let you put vinegar on your fries. That's it. Mm-hmm. Now, why? But there's something about that kind of the power to say no that somehow gives you credibility, I think. And by the way, I've got to be very careful here because there's a colleague of mine who is called Paul Matheson, who's a much greater connoisseur of bacon sandwiches and cafe food than I am. And he actually has ketchup on it. Now, his wife disagrees. His wife has brown sauce. He actually has ketchup on his bacon sandwich in the morning. I still think that's wrong. I think it's HB sauce or nothing. But he's a great connoisseur, so I respect his judgment in that to that extent. But it still strikes me as slightly deviant. But that power just to go, no, you can have it like this or not at all, is a really weird thing, you know. And that's why I wouldn't sell coffee. It's just you have a cup of builder's tea. I always love that. Now, actually, Justin Fattorini, who I mentioned earlier, we mentioned, I think might have mentioned this in the last podcast. Someone once brilliantly said there are only two drinks you can have with fish and chips, which is strong tea or champagne. And actually, Justin Fattorini makes the case for Fino Sherry with fish and chips, which I have tried, and I have to say is probably right. Really
it's these odd little things. I remember there was a DJ called Mr. Scruff. This was like 6 years ago, and I was at uni. But he's like an old...
And by the way, that's a good way to rescue sherry, isn't it? You just go around fish and chip shops.
Yeah.
You campaign for fish and chip shops to be licensed to sell fortified wines and beers, and you basically just you set up a standard thing, which is half a bottle of sherry. You know,
it's it's.
So tell me, sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's fine. So this was 2016, right?
The DJ.
His name was Mr. Scruff. I remember it, but he purposely said on the ticket sales, as you were queuing to get into the club, you are not allowed to take phones, and there are no phones, right? So basically, all phones have to be put. You can't put your phone. Because now you go to a gig, right? Every fucker's got a thing like that.
Yeah.
And it almost, I know it's probably it's way too hip. So I know we talked last time about hipsters raise the ceiling, change raise the floor. It's very Manchester Northern core hipster, but but everyone was suddenly pulled to go to that night because you're just going to be in the moment with the music. Do you know what I mean?
When you leave your phone.
No, it's as in you could be on your phone. It's not like a comedy club. You know, like comedy clubs where you've got to put them in the thing. It's not like that.
But he just said you can't.
And actually, by doing that, more people went and more people did. So, but I'd love to jump in, Rory, because there's so much we can talk about. But the first kind of pathway I want to explore with you is there's a quote by Ernest Hemingway, which is I kind of live by with a lot of my writing, and even when I come up the questions for podcasts. And it's the first draft of everything is shit. Right? I don't know if you've heard that. And the reason I love this is I think in today's society, everyone's so obsessed.
I'm kind to Shakespeare, who allegedly wrote without blotting a line. Yeah. I don't know who on earth has the evidence for that, but there is the claim that he basically just sat down.
But I think what that quote allows you to do, and lots of comedians have that on their laptop there.
The first draft of everything is shit.
And it basically, what it means is that you've got to linking this to alchemy, you've got to get a lot of gold and lead to stumble across gold. So you need a lot of bad ideas to come up with good ideas. You need a lot of mistakes which will allow you to open that side door.
This is a fundamental problem of the way we've designed the world around kind of rational argument.
Yeah.
Which is, if you can only benefit from things that you've argued for in advance that are pre-planned or pre-rationalised, okay, you end up with a very limited solution space. Because actually, even in science, okay, never mind things like comedy, art, painting, etc. Even in science, probably the greater part of progress is unintended. Okay, it's observational, or it's what Nassim Taleb called stochastic tinkering. You know, the reason steam locomotives got...
Sorry.
Don't worry. Stochastic tinkering is like, rather than planning the thing and saying this is what a steam engine should look like, it's building a pretty good steam engine and then continually fiddling around with it to refine it to make it better.
Yes, yeah.
So that, in other words, you're informed by practice rather than just theory. And we're trying to create a world where the theory informs everything. Because we place such a high value on what you might call pre-reasoning. Now, I mean, from my field of advertising, quite a lot, not all, quite a lot of the things that actually happened were not a case of someone planning something and arguing it through. They were a case of something happening accidentally and this is an important and, someone having both the perceptual acuity to notice the significance of it and the confidence to actually use it, okay? In other words, the confidence to act on an accidental occurrence. Now, one of the greatest brand assets you can imagine, the Dulux dog. Okay. Now, you can post-rationalise why it's so great to have an old English sheepdog as a character in a paintwork. Didn't happen like that at all. They were filming in a house which they'd rented. Okay. The owner of the house they'd rented for filming the commercial owned an old English sheepdog, and it kind of escaped and wandered into the shoot. And the director of the commercial said, basically, the dog stays in the picture. Okay. Now, if you're not allowed to do that, because essentially everything in life has to be pre-scripted by a kind of cabal of rationalist accountants and, then actually your potential creative solution space is about a tenth the size that it could be. And, I'm going off on Saturday to be interviewed by Rick Rubin for his podcast. And, he completely accepts the role of serendipity, accident, deliberate imposed randomness, or in some cases, another creative technique is what you might call the intermediate impossible. So you say, we've got to make money from an airline, but the one limitation is the planes aren't allowed to leave.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. What were those three things?
Well, all of them are what you might call a case where you allow both fortune, serendipity, experience, and unintended consequences to inform the nature of your solution. Okay. In other words, you're not theory first, practice later. You accept that there's a constant feedback loop between doing and thinking.
That's why I like the first draft of everything is shit. It's because it allows for that serendipity.
I mean, someone once said, which is not a bad criticism of socialism, socialism is a political doctrine based on the mistaken belief that you can get things right first time. In other words, you have a theory of how the world should work, and the theory appeals to you, so you go and then unquestioningly impose it on reality,
For sure, what I want to...
probably a better criticism of communism.
I want to almost... Imagine I think everyone in their early career we're taught to go down this one route where it's that whole pre-planning, pre-rationalising your life at 18, I think, is nuts, right? We want to do this.
Yeah, but I had a friend who was the head of policy for the Liberal Democrats, and he said one of the things that he thinks is undoubtedly true but politically unsayable is that it's actually pretty good for people to bum around at the beginning of their lives working out what they want to do, because they will find, therefore, what they end up doing for the next 20 years more rewarding, and they'll be better at it. Okay? But he said the idea that actually some period of youth unemployment is desirable is just politically unsayable is probably right.
Yeah.
It's
no, for sure. It's someone I interviewed a guy called David Hyatt. It's just because you know the problem doesn't mean you know the solution, right? Which I thought was brilliant. But what I want to do is imagine we've got your...
And also, do you want to win arguments or do you want to solve problems? Because the processes required are actually quite different. And yet we tend to reward people, promote people, put people in positions of power according to their ability at winning arguments, which is not a good proxy.
So imagine we've got that first part of your career as a transcript, right? That's your first draft. It's the Ernest Hemingway, the first draft of everything shit. I'm not saying it was shit, right? But I want to imagine you've got a highlighter, right? And you can highlight what are the one or two at the time seemingly kind of insurmountable fuck ups almost, or things that you got really wrong early on that have actually taught you serious lessons. That is why you're having an interview with Rick Rubin on Saturday.
I totally misunderstood the nature of organizations because my father's self-employed.
What does he do?
Entrepreneur, mixture of property developer, runs a series of small businesses. He ran a kind of water boat on a canal, taking parties. He was sort of, serial and mixed entrepreneur, mostly in property. Of one kind or another, typically restoring old large houses and converting them into apartments and so on. And I found it very difficult, having grown up in a business environment where you do everything, to to grow up, to then move to a business environment. I mean, virtually all of my family, in terms of my ancestry, were sort of self-employed or autonomous individuals. You know, one of them was a GP with their own practice. There were kind of school teachers who had their own schools. They're mostly farmers, actually. The odd few shopkeepers. And
You're right, that a bit closer.
sorry.
Yes,
and that business of effectively dividing responsibilities in a large organization where your job is to do the marketing, your job is to do the finance, was completely baffling to me because you'd always done everything, you know. And so I really spent sort of the first 3 years floundering about, failing to understand how a business worked. Now, in some ways, I think in the long term, that was actually an advantage. Because my natural assumption was to look at questions from a systems perspective, not a component parts perspective. Now, I've always wondered, if you look at the success, absolutely disproportionate, insanely disproportionate commercial success of various ethnic groups, okay, who have typically entered the country through shopkeeping, okay, or possibly running a restaurant. The family business, whether it's, you know, Indians, you know, it would have been sort of Jewish tailors in the 19th century, etc. One of the probable reasons, I suspect, funny enough, this applies to Rishi Sunak, I guess, is that if you grow up in a shop, it's a free MBA. You know, if you grow up in a shop, if you grow up in a restaurant, in a sense, you actually get to understand everything, the whole equation of business. And as a consequence, you don't look at a business through its component parts, through a kind of, you know, divide and optimize approach. You actually look at the business as a whole because you have the power, in a sense, to influence all of those different... So you naturally think strategically in a way that I think most people in organizations don't, because they've been given what I call a quarter of the Sudoku. I don't know if you do Sudokus. Do you?
No, numbers, words I'm down to play with. Numbers, even that book I tried to read.
But the way I describe an awful lot of large businesses' approach to things is the assumption that the optimization of the parts will lead to the optimization of the whole. In fact, those are actually contradictions. If you optimize individual parts of a complex system, by definition, what you achieve overall is suboptimal. And the way I describe it is there are lots of... You can't cut a Sudoku into 9 squares, hand them out to 9 different people and say, can you solve your bit of the puzzle? If you haven't got the whole thing, you can't solve it. And I think that may be why, people who grow up in shops, people who grow up in small businesses, actually, it undoubtedly ill-equips you in a way for working in large organizations. Because what the large organization is doing seems stupid, and so you don't play the game. But on the other hand, deep down, you're right not to play the game because the game is stupid.
So how did that... I completely agree. It's like you want the few... So you said if we're going to highlight not one fuck up, but you said that you had that almost shopkeeper learning growing up, right? So you then get thrust into a big organisation.
I think...
Is there any other...
I also think this is something that businesses have lost. I think there was genuinely a period where businesses, the finance, HR, bureaucratic apparatus was sufficiently deprived of information and powerless, so that the way the business worked was that the practitioners worked out how to add value, and then the other people worked out how to make money out of it, okay? In that order. And I think we've created a business environment where the people who count the money, okay, effectively start determining what value is. Okay? And to them, what is value is what makes money. And therefore, they encourage the business to do more of what makes money, okay, and less of what doesn't make money. But the actual customer value being created isn't necessarily where the money's being made. I used to give this sort of slightly politically incorrect analogy, which is, someone from a consulting firm, apparently not very far from here. I've never been, I promise, but in Soho, there are bars where you pay £100 for a bottle of champagne, which is actually cider masquerading as champagne. So sparkling cider, and someone with not many clothes on comes and sits next to you and makes a fuss of you, okay? Well, if you're not careful, you go into a business like this and go, well, I don't really understand what's going on here because we have this incredibly profitable bar business, but then we have these girls who seem to be a complete overhead, okay? But no one's paying $100 for your goddamn cider, okay, in the absence of the other. And I think, in ad agencies, what makes money, we're paid by the hour, is time-consuming processes. What adds value may, in some cases, be a 20-second insight, flash of insight.
It's in putting this through a food and drink lens, like for charity.
Well, you see, this is why I love the restaurant business.
But also
analogy, in a way, understanding the quick service restaurant business and the restaurant business, and they're sort of different, but they're connected, is a brilliant kind of comprehensible metaphor.
But it's also, I've got a thing where for food and drink brands going into retail, right, is you can't understand the one without the other. Whereas people
who discovered that weird Japanese thing, which is like peanuts and chili.
Yeah, that's why I sent you. I didn't discover it.
It's absolutely sensational, isn't it? Luckily, Harvey Nichols sells it.
Yeah, I can get you.
I'd be begging you for another $5.
They've just got another.
What's it called?
It's called White Mouse It.
That's it.
Yeah, so so they are they're genius because they've.
Has it always existed?
It's always existed. They're based in Ireland. So he was at this bread and jam last week, Lorcan. He's a good mate of mine. But they've gotten some new flavours, like a smoky chili oil, which is just, oh, man, I see it on a Chinese. I was like sodomising that last night on Sunday night with some leftover Chinese and duck. It was just sensuous.
It improves everything.
It does everything. Yeah. Quite literally everything. But sorry, my point is when the analogy of we can just call it maybe a gentleman's club where you have you're paying for the booze and that looks like one thing, and then you're actually the value is the topless lady, right? With food and drink brands going into retail, is you can sometimes think, I always say the COGS, i.e. the cost of producing the product, right?
Yeah.
That is actually a marketing spend, not a cost of goods. But if you're looking at an Excel spreadsheet, you think, oh, these are the cost of
course.
But actually, if the product tastes shit, then no one's going to come back and buy it again. Whereas what people do is they separate, right, we're going to spend this much on commercials, say it's just 10 grand, putting numbers out of thin air, right? And that is going to drive that many Facebook ads and that many shoppers to store. They'll come into the store, they'll buy this Diet Coke. If it tastes like shit, they ain't coming back. Whereas they took 7 grand out of that and put it into making the product taste better, right? Then they may not be able to get as many people coming back short term, but the people will come back in, buy it, like it, and tell their friends about it.
That's one really useful thing, by the way, about loyalty programs in supermarkets, or indeed if you're a Ocado.
Yeah.
Longitudinal customer data, which is how many people are buying the damn thing is not very valuable information. How many people are repurchasing it is really valuable information. So I always make the distinction. I always say, look, if you want to spot a trend, spot a thing that a few people are doing repeatedly. That has the potential to become air fryers. Nobody who had an air fryer ever went back, right? No one ever reverts. That's the thing to look for. And so one of the things I love to do is look at supermarket loyalty data and go, what are the really, really nichey things that you're thinking of delisting, which actually maybe the reason people go to your damn supermarket, right? You get rid of a few of those kind of nichier things, you might be losing rather a lot of visits on the back of it.
Well, that was the other thing is in food and drink, there's the great taste stars. You told me this idea actually of shopping by great taste stars.
Yeah, why doesn't Ocado have a separate listing?
Well, the first thing is every brand in this industry, they'll get 3 great taste stars, and we got them at my previous company, and that's really bloody hard to get.
3 is really...
So it's like you have
1 is not easy,
you have
3 is really
1, 2, 3, right? And so
if I see anything with 3, I basically buy it.
Yeah, exactly. But like Tom, Dick, Jane, and Harry, up and down the country, don't know there's even such thing as 1, 2, 3.
No, they don't. No.
So I think supermarkets should put a gondola end in with a fuckload of...
so our 3-star...
This is our 3-star, this is our 2-star, this is our 1-star. And actually educate the consumer on what it is, on what this whole star thing is.
Because they tend to be pretty high margin products, if I'm being honest.
And you could also say you could almost say it's like the easiest analogy is it's like Luton FC. No, maybe not Luton FC. That's a bit disparaging. But it's like
steady on,
yeah,
steady on. Apologies
Well,
to any listeners in Luton.
No, but they've actually just been
Bizarrely, my father's carpenter lives in South Wales, but follows Luton FC all over the country. Of course,
yeah.
So he's
Well, I mean,
ecstatic. His wife isn't ecstatic.
Maybe I shouldn't be so dirt by actual football club, but it's like Championship football, Premier League football, Champions League.
Yeah.
Because the three great taste stars is the Champions League. It's super hard to get into if you get it. But I think you're so right. Shoppers they do B Corp bays in Waitrose.
Yeah.
I think there'd be a huge...
the choice architecture of food is really interesting. I mean, supermarkets are weird in the sense that where things are on the shelf seems to be a product of how things were defined in about 1930. It's a bit like London bus routes, which don't seem to change for the most part. You can understand why tube lines don't change, but bus routes, you'd think someone would have... I looked at a sort of Edwardian bus map of London and it was kind of recognisable. But... the interesting thing there, I think, is that I always notice, and it drives me nuts, okay, that posh, and indeed cheap, but posh sugar lumps are next to flour and baking goods, because sugar is determined to be a baking good, which is probably more true than it was a few years ago, since more people bake. But sugar lumps aren't a baking good. They should be next to the posh tea and coffee. Why on earth aren't you selling those crystalline brown things with a parrot on? Why aren't you selling them at a big markup next to the blinged up, fake Nespresso pods or whatever? It seems very weird to me.
It is super weird. What I want to talk about now is The Confessions of Advertising Man by David Ogilvy. I just love that book.
It's a glorious book.
Well, I think it's one of the best, most pithy, lucidly clear. It's just insane. First question is: did you ever meet David Ogilvy?
Yes.
What did that feel like? Like he's a genuinely a hero of mine. Like I'd love to.
I met him only once. I knew his wife and know his wife very well because after David died, we quite often went down to the Chateau de Tufu at the time before his wife sold it, and it was a kind of place where we'd go for brainstorming sessions and so on.
Right.
So his wife Herta is obviously a fantastic repository of David's stories as well as being absolutely remarkable in her own right. I mean, fabulous.
Where was it when
I
you
only
met
met him once, and I can time it more or less exactly because David was terrified of flying, and as a consequence, rarely came to the UK. The one visit he made during my time at Ogilvy in London, I'm still there, but 88 to he died in 99, I think. So in the 11 years when he was alive and I worked at Ogilvy, his one visit to London was just after the the Eurostar opened. And he came by train and he pinned up his work and, gave a presentation of his work. And he was, at the time, I suppose he would have been, he was born in 1911, if I'm right. So he would have been in his mid-80s, I would think. I think I cancelled a holiday. I heard he was coming over, and I think I cancelled a holiday to be there because I thought this may well, as indeed it was, this may well be your only chance. And he was genuinely quite extraordinary.
Genuinely quite extraordinary how? Because I always, one question I ask to guests, right, is you can read all the books in the world, but there's something you pick up from osmosis and nuance from people. Do you know what I mean? Like... why was he quite remarkable?
One of the things is he clearly maintained right into his 80s a kind which he always had, I think, a kind of grumpiness with the wider advertising industry, which you might call divine discontent. That was what he usually called it. I remember my colleague arrived. We were both in the direct marketing part of Ogilvy at the time, what was then called Ogilvy and Mather Direct. And when we introduced ourselves as being from Direct, he kind of embraced us and said, "Thank God, a proper salesman." So his love of direct marketing was perfectly sincere, by the way. I mean, his office, as well as being in the Chateau de Tufu, which is about 4 hours from Paris, in not far from Poitiers. His office in the French agency was in the direct marketing agency, not in the advertising agency. And they've actually preserved it rather magnificently. So if you go to if you ever go to Ogilvy, Paris, there's a kind of recreation of David's office.
Because his whole thing, which
Ashtrays
I
and all.
find fascinating, and I was speaking to a guy yesterday who's Gordon Ramsay's new business partner called Hexclad. They're doing reinventing cookware. Genius.
Yeah.
Huge business. But what we were talking about is how David Ogilvy's whole thing was like, it's got to sell. Like one of his big things is it's got to be able to sell.
Yeah. If it doesn't sell, it's not creative.
That's it. Yeah. And then Seth Godin, who's the marketing guru, you should say, his favorite book is a guy he talks about all the time is Zig Ziglar, who wrote a book called his book that he basically read 100 times is called The Secrets of Closing the Sale. And what I find fascinating is these two formidable marketing guys are actually super obsessed with sales. Do you know what I mean? Because I think it can get quite wishy-washy. Do you know what I mean? And maybe that's a brazen way of saying it.
There's a great book, actually, which I really recommend called $100 Million Offers by Alex Hormozy, who's an American who made a fortune selling effectively software for small gyms. And that's kind of wonderful business you can have in the US because the overall market is so vast. You have this vast, monolingual market. He made the brilliant point that, if you're selling, just business management software, you can charge sort of 10 or 20, £50 for it. If you're selling gym management software, you can charge £5,000 for it. And if you're selling small gym management software, you can charge even more because people pay according to specificity. But that's another book which I'd really recommend everybody read because it's really, really interesting on what you might call the proposition. Now, this is an area of marketing which I think is always neglected. I'm always interested. I'm a huge fan of both Byron Sharp and Mark Ritson.
Yeah.
We find, I think, between us, we come at the same thing from different approaches, but between us, there are things we disagree on, but not that much. And they're probably right. I fundamentally accept the fact, by the way, that some of the things I say are wrong. My point is that being wrong occasionally is the price you pay for being interesting. Okay. Yeah. And it's a trade-off we just have to accept. And one of the things that's grossly underexplored in business, I'd include in this the restaurant business, is what I didn't know the name for it. And you could call it the offer. Okay, you could call it it was occasionally called the offer in marketing, occasionally the proposition. Procter & Gamble called it commercial innovation. And commercial innovation is what happens where you don't innovate the product itself. You innovate different ways of selling it, pricing it, packaging it. And actually the scope for gains in commercial innovation. So I'll give you an example of what might be considered a commercial innovation. I met some wonderful people at Nudgestock, actually at MadFest, who came from Great British Railways, which is to be the new kind of unitary body providing for rail travel across the UK, above and beyond the train operating companies and so on. And back in the day, now there'll be 50-year-olds in Britain becoming nostalgic about this. There was a brilliant, brilliant promotion with Persil, which is that if you bought a certain amount of Persil, you got cheap family off-peak rail tickets. Because they had a high perceived value. In fact, the cost to a rail company of giving away off-peak travel is actually quite small. I would argue that actually it's wrong to think of it as a cost. It's a sampling exercise. A lot of people never travel by train. They don't travel by train because they don't travel by train. Therefore, they find train travel unfamiliar and baffling and slightly intimidating. And the trick is to get them to travel by train 3 times, at which point next time they have a journey to make, they're at least making a kind of reasonably balanced decision between car and train. But one of the things they were rather wonderfully discussing was, do you think there's scope for kind of almost Amazon Prime of train travel so that, for example, could retired people pay £500 a year in order to have unlimited train travel on any train that wasn't fully booked 24 hours beforehand, for example? In other words, there are loads and loads of ways you can sell a train seat other than peak, off-peak, first class, second class. Amazon Prime is a really interesting case. It's a really fantastic case of commercial innovation. In other words, rather than charging for delivery every time, we charge for it kind of once and we give you some films. I mean,
Yeah.
Okay. But I mean, actually, I think in the restaurant business, I have no doubt that there's scope for, I suppose you could argue that the subsidised Happy Meal, I'm assuming Happy Meals are subsidised, I may be wrong, maybe Happy Meals are quite profitable. But those kind of things where you actually, I'll give you a very good example in the restaurant business. It's even more acute in the hotel business, okay? If you have a childless double-earning couple staying in a hotel room, okay?
Yeah.
That's typically 2 salaries paying for 1 room. Mm-hmm. If you have a couple with kids staying in a hotel, that's typically 1 salary paying for 2 rooms. So with you. Okay, you're kind of with me. Okay. Let's say that, the person's taking a bit of time off to look after the kids. That means that a hotel stay is 4 times as expensive for a family as it is for a dual-earning couple. So effectively, Premier Inn is to the family what the, not quite the Intercontinental, but you get my point, okay? What the Hyatt is, okay, to a dual-earning couple. Now, given that anybody with kids patently isn't travelling on business, therefore you're not actually cannibalising sort of high-revenue business traffic, it would seem bloody obvious for hotels to do second room half price, or even cleverer still, if the hotel isn't fully booked, we'll refund you on the cost of the second room. Now, let's imagine you did that, okay? And you go and stay in your Holiday Inn, right? And you got kids, and you book the 2 rooms, and they go, well, the hotel wasn't full last night, so we've put £150 credit on your bloody bill, right? Now, well, where are you going to stay next time? You're going to stay at the effing Holiday Inn, aren't you, right? Because you've got £150 credit sitting there, okay? Now, in restaurants, I suppose KFC does it with the bucket, okay? But feeding a family with 1 salary is inordinately more expensive than feeding yourself, a couple with 2 salaries. Not quite as extreme as the hotel case, but it's not far off. It seems weird that fast food restaurants mostly price, as we said, the KFC buckets, they're an exception. But most fast food restaurants price by the item, not by the... Now, as a result, undoubtedly, there's an economic inefficiency there in that if you are prepared to make a concession to families and you could make sure there wasn't any what you might call gaming of the system or what you might call revenue dilution. In other words, you didn't get 4 strangers outside all pretending to be a family and coming in, which might happen. Okay, not going to happen in a hotel. I'm not going to sleep with a bloody stranger to say, draw the line at that. But if you can create interesting different ways in which you can price things according to people's ability to pay, price discrimination, if you can find a small niche group of people who can basically take dud inventory off your hands. So there's quite a clever app called Hotel Tonight. And the whole thing is you've got to book a hotel that day. Now, a tourist isn't going to do it. A business person isn't going to do it, right? Yeah. But if you're pissed and you missed the last train, okay, Hotel Tonight's perfect because they sell a room they wouldn't otherwise have sold. And I asked hotels, how much do you need from a hotel room to more than break even, including the cost of just turning over the room? And it's kind of 15, 20 quid, roughly. Probably a bit less than that. They're probably exaggerating. But, those kind of things, those kind of what you might call exploring the value exchange things in commercial innovation strike me. And I think the reason they don't happen, I'll tell you why they don't happen, is because marketing no longer has responsibility properly for pricing. It doesn't really control the 5 Ps. It's become devolved into a kind of, Marcom's ghetto of, hey, it's just like reprographics, okay? And as a result, that kind of thing falls between several stools. And as a result, it's consequently underexplored. Another area that's hugely underexplored, and I've become an absolute fanatic for this very small niche WPP company. They're in the same building as us, and they're called Mando Connect. And they specialise in brand partnerships. And they're one of very few entities who do this. But as indeed Mark Ritson says, brand partnerships are a completely underexplored source of value creation. And again, I suspect the reason is exactly the same. Either ad agencies don't know how to make any money out of them, so they don't propose them, which is quite possible. On the client side, it probably falls between two stools. It's no one's responsibility in many cases. But actually, the potential there for symbiotic relationships between different brands is absolutely immense.
And brands that it doesn't have to be two brands in the same space.
No.
So
In fact, what it can quite often be is a big established brand and a small cool brand.
Have you heard of Trip, CBD drink?
Yes. In fact, I've consumed it occasionally with mildly pleasant results.
Yeah. It's good.
Not so keen on the THC. I've consumed a few of those THC sweets, and they're a bit.
You'll get very creative after a few of those, don't you? Yeah. I've never ventured into that arena.
I know. I've tried Trip. I've quite enjoyed it. Yeah.
But so they did. So I interviewed Liv on this podcast, and they're the fastest growing drinks brand in the UK. They're really taking off. And she met the founder of Calm, the meditation app, at like a Soho House event, whatever it was. And the sort of place of serendipity there, right? But they did a partnership where Calm were the big brand, right? And they did put it all over. I think that was like a discount. If you're a Calm user, you got a discount on the D2C website or something like that.
Bingo.
But for people listening to this, especially challenger brands, is brand partnerships are brilliant. And also, it's like, it doesn't have to be like it doesn't, as I was saying, it doesn't have to be like a cross category. It doesn't even have to be in the same industry. Do you know what I mean? It could be something completely different.
No. I mean, in fact, there was a partnership we did between a small app and, she did a partnership with Marks and Spencer's, for example.
Yeah.
Small gifting app and Marks and Spencer's. That's exactly the kind of thing which you can do, which is kind of a win-win, because the big brand earns cool points and the small brand gets exposure, scale, and a degree of credibility. And so it's kind of symbiotic relationship between, cool and rich, actually, funnily enough, that is quite often a symbiotic relationship in humanity, isn't it? Because rich people tend not to be cool. So, one of the things you notice is that cool people get co-opted by the rich, for example. But those kind of things, and actually what used to happen is people used to talk total nonsense about brand partnerships. So they'd say things like, oh no, it dilutes your brand. Okay. It sounds very plausible, but then I said, well, that's a bit like saying that my having friends dilutes my personality. It's not a sensible, it's one of those things that sounds a reason, but it's not. It's bullshit.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to David Ogilvy, because you talked about, you'd met him and he was an extraordinary guy. What are some of the specific, like...
A lot of other, by the way, I mean, just to give full credit, I mean, Ogilvy was pretty remarkable, pretty replete for a period with quite a few. I mean, Steve Harrison and Drayton Bird, for example. I don't know how well you know Drayton Bird, but he was kind of the direct marketing guru of the UK. Still is, in many ways. He's still practicing at about 80-something. And is an absolutely brilliant person who has an enormous influence on me, along with a bunch of other people who've come through Ogilvy and continue to come through Ogilvy.
Yeah, what are some of those lessons from that? Are these people you record to, like the Dead Spiders? Is that what? I remember.
Yes, do you know about the Dead Spiders?
Because it was in. I remember thinking it was like some sort of either like David Bowie sort of weird tribute act, or like I think it was in your book, and it was like Dave Trott. And there was it was like a gag.
There's a bunch of oldsters, including me. I'm probably one of the younger ones, relatively, from the advertising industry. And we actually need to reconvene. It's been a long time. It all arose from a mishearing that someone had started an agency called Red Spider, and someone thought it was called Dead Spider, and they thought it was pretty strange.
It does sound like it's the sort of place you would go to some sort of underground bar and.
But we would occasionally have a Dead Spiders. Funny enough, there was a strange accusation of that guy, Nick. Do you remember that guy who was making completely spurious accusations against politicians? And he was convinced there was this sort of weird paedophile conspiracy going deep into the establishment, and that, the head of the army and 3 Conservative cabinet ministers were murdering a boy and throwing dead spiders over him. So maybe we need to rename in the light of that. But pretty odd. I have to say that's pretty odd paraphilia, throwing dead spiders on people, I have to say. But It's, I think it's one of the interesting things is that marketing is actually more interesting, more powerful, and has more potential than even marketers realise in many cases.
How?
That so much of value is perceptually determined. Okay. Now, if you take Trip, for example, we don't know the counterfactual, but let's say they'd sold it in a big can, not a small can. Okay. Quite possibly wouldn't have worked. Yeah. There are all these weird things that, something medicinal, something that's perceived to be potent. And the most extreme case of that, those ginger shots you now buy for about £2.15, they're expensive because they're small.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so if you proceed as though the world is a rational space and that consumers have an objective perception on reality and are utility maximizers and blah, 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 you'll get a lot really, really badly wrong because most really interesting ideas have an element of the nonsensical. This is exactly why I get back to my point about if I open, which I don't want to open, I'd love someone else to open it. If you open up bacon sandwich, you'd refuse to serve ketchup. Now, I don't know why you do that, but I just have a hunch that if you want to establish yourself as a food lover's food place, those weird eccentric rules kind of convey something about you.
Have you heard of Le Swine? You'll need to get this.
Go on.
Le Swine. So I was at the a trade show or an event they did at the Old Truman Brewery. This was like 5 years ago. And they've basically done that, where they've just focused on perfecting the bacon sandwich. They've got a bloody good business that... I'm going to try and pull this up, actually.
Because the bacon sandwich is, assuming you can eat bacon, which isn't everybody, is an extraordinary item of food.
But that's the definition of less is more with the bacon sandwich, because... I mean, I've had it before, like where I've tried to put chili on it, it just ruins it. It just needs to be shit bread, butter.
The bread's going to have, I think, the roll with a bit of dust on it. I think it's going to have dust.
Yes.
I don't know what the contribution is of the dust.
Find this, but
in a dusty roll, or perhaps a stotty if you're from the northeast.
So you get old-fashioned middle bacon, right? Bacon butter, milk and onion buns, which are just gorgeous. Fresh sage.
Yeah.
You don't get a tomato ketchup, you get a chipotle and mushroom ketchup, and you get a bacon guide, which is that value add at the end. I'll show you.
Can you have brown sauce?
I mean, you can't have brown sauce.
Yeah, that's not right. That's not right. Yeah.
I think so. I prefer brown sauce with sausages. I think that's...
Oh, no. You see, I don't know. I think... but that's really interesting because that business of taking one thing
and doing it well,
and the apotheosis of it,
is.
I mean, Five Guys is really interesting from that standpoint. It's a very, really interesting business.
The other thing you could almost do on that is, your psychophysics thing, where it's like things. I don't know. Yeah. I may have not got it down, but I've been thinking about it so much. But when you eat a pizza with a knife and fork, which I will sometimes do, right?
Yes.
So if I'm in a pizza, there's a place in Wandsworth Common called Pizza Travolta, which does an insane pizza. Really, really good.
I think it's actually better with a knife.
It's 10 times better. It's 10 times better. If you're getting a Domino's, but it changes the taste of it. If you're
completely.
If you were to get open a restaurant, which it's like almost, you can only eat your pizza with a knife and fork. But there's that,
which I suppose is Pizza Express to some extent.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
And
Pizza Express's thing is which I think is beautiful, which is your marble table awaits you. That's their strapline on Instagram, at least.
Oh, interesting.
Your marble table awaits you.
Nice.
So clever.
That's really, really nice. So spotting those details, and actually the marble table is clever because it isn't a tablecloth which signifies fine dining, but nor is it something rudimentary. And I'm always interested in the things we know without knowing them. It's technically called tacit knowledge, and there's most of what we do is based on tacit knowledge, actually. In other words, things we know at an unconscious... So the classic example, I don't know if you watch Clarkson's Farm.
Actually, I haven't watched that, no.
But what's the guy called? But reversing a trailer into a narrow gate, okay, with a tractor. As Caleb says, I can't tell you how to do it, you just have to know how. And it's almost certainly right, so you could get the professor of bloody engineering Imperial College and ask him to reverse a trailer into a gate and he'd cock it up. But someone who just unconsciously learned how to do it would do it in one. I used to, when I went to Cambridge, I was at a college which was opposite Marks and Spencer's, and they'd actually paid the college a large amount of money for the right to reverse articulated lorries into a small entrance, because that was the only way the lorries could turn. And watching those guys do it, or watching people reverse up to a loading bay, is just art, because you can't explain how to do it. You've just got to know.
So I used to deliver cheese, was my job, random job.
Whoa.
Yeah, random job. So I left uni and was like, what am I going to do with my life? But it was actually quite good delivering cheese, because I'd have, I was getting paid bugger all, 8-9 hours a day just listening to podcasts. This is 2016, and now I've got a podcast. So back to that. What was the first draft of everything is shit? What at the time?
So actually, quite a lot of that may be that it's by doing things that we acquire this tacit knowledge. And the tacit knowledge that interests me in the restaurant trade is what's different in a cafe and a restaurant, which is actually really interesting, because I think it's that you can go into a cafe and just order a drink, and it's not weird. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And actually, you can upgrade your order from drink to food, which is something Starbucks is obviously very eager for people to do. But fundamentally, going in there, ordering a drink and leaving is totally okay. In fact, completely normal. Okay. And indeed, in the modern age, going into a cafe and opening up a laptop and then ordering a drink is totally normal. In a restaurant, it isn't. And so that very interesting thing that Kavi did at Dishoom, which is how do we create an Indian restaurant which is full at lunchtime, and they cracked the problem by doing breakfast. That was brilliant, because the fact that actually as you walk past at 11 o'clock, 11:30, 12 o'clock, there are some people already in there. Okay. We instinctively go, it's okay going in there because there are already people in there. I don't want to go in there because, funny enough, for years I worked in Soho Square. I absolutely loved Korean food, and right round the corner was a Korean restaurant. But I never saw anybody in there, and so I never went in. And I only learned, and this may be some aspect of Korean culture, I have no idea, they never seated people by the window. So the place was actually full to half full all the time, but they seated everybody in the back. And then they had this small part of the restaurant, which was the window. There's nobody ever there. I never went in. We do these things. We make these kind of inferences all the time without being aware of doing so.
Back to your great analogy of the champagne and the topless ladies, right? Is have you heard of Padella, the pasta restaurant? So they did something genius. I'll show you this. Is they just started making their pasta, rolling pasta in the morning, in the window. Right?
Oh, bliss.
So
before they open,
so every commuter is coming out London Bridge Station, and then there's people making fresh pasta at the front of the window. The queue is, I only managed to get in there twice, right?
Other signals are put chairs and tables outside on the pavement if you can.
Yeah.
Because from 500 yards away it says,
come a bit closer to that.
500 yards away it says there's a place to eat here and it's open.
Yeah.
Because if it wasn't open, they would have put the chairs away. There are ways in which you can communicate through, as I said, kind of unconscious inference, which are really, really potent. That's a beautiful idea. There's another one I was thinking of which did something similarly clever. But that business of actually you're walking past in the morning.
It's storytelling, and then it's rammed, and by default of just being busy because it's a small restaurant, you're queuing, so you automatically think the scarcity is going to taste better.
Yeah.
What I want to talk about now is I know you know. Nuss and Celeb, I think you wrote the forward for your book. I've explored this. So Challenger Brands, the triad is almost like fragile, robust, anti-fragile. I generally think Challenger Brands are inherently fragile, whereby often you're at the mercy of the retailer having the kind of controlling the distribution. Inflation, quality control in food is very, very hard. So brands can be quite inherently fragile. They can be robust in terms of, I think, like branding is robust, or packaging is robust. I think distribution can be robust if you're an established brand. But I'd love to try to explore
Then there's a miracle, which is Coca-Cola. Okay. And I genuinely mean it's a miracle because it's the only cold non-alcoholic drink apart from water where anywhere from a beach shack in Zambia, okay, or indeed an inland Zambia, a drink shack, okay, to a Michelin-starred restaurant, if you ask for it and they don't have it, it's their fault, not yours.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, there is an obligation to actually offer it, which is and also there is absolutely nothing unusual in either of those two extreme circumstances in asking for it to drink. Okay. Now you wouldn't go to the Manuel Cats's and go, "You got a Dr. Pepper Zero," right? You know.
My friend went into the into St. John.
Although I am quite a fan of Fanta Lemon, actually, I think that deserves its place in the pantheon.
especially in on holiday. That my mate went into the he rocked up to St. John. We were going to St. John, and he rocked up in we went actually with Sarah actually the other week, but he rocked up and asked for a vodka Diet Coke vodka lemonade, and the waitress sort of looked at him like, "You fucking crazy," because it's obviously it's a wine bar, right? Look, it's almost works in the reverse.
Do they not sell spirits there? 'Cause I've never tried to order. I usually drank Guinness there, actually.
They did, yeah. So what I'd love to talk about is what's again kind of he's another big inspiration for mine, Taleb, like the Anti-Fragile book. What are some of the things?
Extraordinarily important stuff. Because
what sort of stuff's he taught you for that could? I don't know.
Well, I mean, everything from Fooled by Randomness. Obviously, there's Bed of Procrustes. There's Anti-Fragile, and some of the later work being Skin in the Game.
Yeah,
but what you could almost describe it as is social physics, which is, I mean, there is actually an academic discipline you won't believe called cliodynamics, which is named after Clio, the muse of history, and dynamics. And there's a guy called Peter Turchin.
Sorry, cliodynamics
is basically history as viewed almost as a physical complex system. And so Turchin believes that certain civilizations reach a point of kind of turmoil and near collapse at certain points, partly driven by a thing called elite overproduction, which is that you have more people with an expectation of a great job than there are powerful jobs available. And the people who then fail to make the cut tend to become revolutionary because they want to disrupt the status quo, because anything that disrupts the status quo and diminishes the status of the people who have got elite jobs is basically in their interests. And so that's why he would argue that's why you tend to get revolutionary movements actually weirdly come from the kind of upper middle class in many cases, not often from the most poor. In other words, they're led by middle class people. Now, okay, I won't go into that because, if we wanted to have a discussion about that as a whole separate podcast, I don't know enough to talk about it for more than 10 minutes, I suspect. But there is a kind of, Nassim's point about minority rule, for example, which is if you have one group of people who will only do A and another group of people who are happy doing A and B, they may prefer B, but they're content to do A, okay?
Example.
You end up with it. Well, an example would be that all the soft drinks in the United States are kosher. Most of the lamb in the UK is halal, which is that obviously Muslims won't eat non-halal lamb, but people who aren't Muslims, with the technical exception of Sikhs, interestingly, I think technically Sikhs are supposed not to eat halal food for reasons I don't fully understand, but there is a technical exception to that. But most Christians, atheists, whatever, don't really care whether the lamb's halal or not. So to save yourself having to have two completely separate supply chains for everything, keeping it all separate, you just make everything halal, you make all the soft drinks kosher. And you keep it simple that way. And so people who exercise a right of veto have power disproportionate to their numbers. So an example of that would be, I would never open a fish restaurant unless I was by the sea. And the reason is, unless you're by the seaside, there's always going to be one person in a party of 6 who goes, I don't feel like eating fish. Either they don't like fish, or they're vegetarian, or they had fish yesterday, or they're just not in the mood. Okay. Now, pizza, by contrast, one of the reasons for the success of pizza isn't necessarily that everybody loves it, it's that very few people hate it. There's a strange argument about this, by the way, with beer, which is the reason Budweiser is the most successful beer. This is Dave Trott writing. The reason Budweiser is the most successful beer in America is because it's everybody's second favourite beer. And so if you're basically, let's say there's a boxing match, you're having a load of people around and you want to provide beer, what you do is you buy a case of, Negra Modelo or whatever for yourself, because that's your favourite beer.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
And then everybody else has Bud because you know that nobody hates it. Okay? In other words, it has... And so what you actually have in the dynamics of any kind of social decision, a decision where one person's behaviour has a bearing on what's offered to other people, is something which is not necessarily a case of majority rule, as you might expect, but actually the opposite. I mean, one of the interesting things, I think, is that veganism is... I think in some ways, I think veganism is a bit unfair to vegetarians. Because it used to be you'd probably get 2 vegetarian options, and now you get 1 bloody vegan option and 1 vegetarian option. And the vegetarians then often end up with no choice at all, if you're unlucky. But in a better world, what you end up with is 1 vegan option and 2 vegetarian options, which then means that simply through the law of averages, okay, some meat eaters are also going to favour the vegetarian option. And so it has a bigger impetus. Once vegetarianism reaches or veganism reach critical mass, okay, they have a bigger effect on overall food consumption than their numbers might actually suggest. Because once you've got to offer it, some people are going to choose it.
But do you know Ottolenghi's restaurant, Rovi? I don't know where...
I've never been, actually.
I don't know why that's clever, but he's got Nopi, which is like a standard restaurant, but then he's got Rovi, which is predominantly vegetarian with a few meat dishes.
Yeah.
Which I don't know how you distill that down, but it's so clever whereby it's like, it's almost doing the opposite. It's the opposite of a good idea is a good idea, right?
So
it's
the
like,
default is vegetarian, but there's a meat option.
yeah.
So what you're absolutely doing is reversing the polarity. Now, that's interesting also because I met someone who did a lot of research into this.
Sorry, I was bring that.
Whenever you talk to people in the meat industry, they always start fulminating against bloody vegans and bloody vegetarians. But a friend of mine who did the research said that the biggest reason for the decline in meat consumption isn't actually veganism or vegetarianism. By far the bigger reason is a preference for people for foodstuffs which contain some meat but not very much. So a pepperoni pizza is not vegetarian, okay? But by comparison with a stew or a steak, it contains relatively small amounts of meat. And so people preferring food that actually has, in other words, the preponderance of foods where meat is a kind of garnish rather than the main feature.
Well, actually, that's on trend because the trend. And actually, to be fair, like I can make him pulling shitting bollocks out of my mouth, right? But like, there's a trend for flexitarianism, right? So everyone says I'm not like, it's not binary. I'm not vegan or I'm not no, I'm not this, but I am cutting down. So 1 coffee a week I'll have with oat milk. I will go and have a vegetarian at a restaurant. But actually, the restaurants that are coming out is either die-hard vegan restaurants, which are like, we're just vegan.
Yeah.
Die-hard vegetarian restaurants, or just standard restaurants. But there needs, I don't think...
You can go to a vegan restaurant and then sprinkle porky scratchings on it.
But what I'm saying is...
I'm not sure how they'd respond to this.
But I don't know why there's not a full-blown flexitarian restaurant. The only restaurant I can think of that's like naming themselves as a flexitarian restaurant, and they're not even doing this, would be that Rovi, where it's like... sometimes I don't always want to have meat with every meal. No. And actually, I think vegetarian curries sometimes even better than normal meat curry, right? Same like with aubergines, not just aubergines.
I had a thing the other day.
Lebanese food's better when it's not meat.
What's that very strange? It's not a plantain. The Indian name for it is something like mogu or something. But it's a particular vegetable... which is not a potato, but it's actually quite hard. But I had a kind of chili version of that, which I can't remember what the damn bloody vegetable was called, but it was sensational, absolutely amazing. And you're probably right, actually, that they probably made the mistake with vegetarian curries were a bit bean heavy, weren't they? Sometimes historically, but actually with really, really imaginative use of interesting vegetables, you could probably do something astonishing.
What are some of your, in terms of because I think why I love restaurants, and brands actually is there's just so much opportunity for alchemy. What are some of your favourite restaurants in London?
Well, I have to admire on both scores, both the branding score and the food score, which is Dishoom, but then I'd be in a lot of company there, I suspect, admiring that. Funnily enough, I was very impressed by Slim Chickens when I went there, which is a sort of southern chicken thing. I shouldn't say that because I sort of work a bit with KFC. One of the things that I liked about it was that I think if you want British people
Where
to
is
eat
this
more
place,
healthily,
sorry?
there is one actually somewhere in Cambridge Circus. I think there's one, quite a big one.
Yeah.
By the way, did you read the book Hospitality Beyond Reason by Will?
No, I need to read that. And
That's an astounding book. If you want me to put you in touch with him for an interview.
oh, that'd be amazing.
One of the most interesting things he did, which is the kind of thing I absolutely love. So he had this restaurant, 11 Madison Park, which at one point actually became, I think, the highest rated restaurant in the world. I'm always a bit skeptical about that because, I mean, damn, the difference between number 75 and number 1 is going to be pretty kind of trivial. But one of the things he did, which I really admire him for, which is effectively a kind of game theory approach, a gamesmanship approach. Now, he went as a sort of competitor review to, I think it was probably Chez Panisse or something like that, with the French Laundry. I can't remember. But one of the best restaurants in New York. And unsurprisingly, he was doing this as a kind of competitive assessment. The experience was fantastic. And then he notices the killer thing, okay? At the end of the meal, what you got was a cup of filter coffee. Okay? That's it. And so he immediately goes back to his restaurant and goes, don't try and beat them at what they're good at. Find their little weak spot. And he did something absolutely brilliant, which is he had already a waiter, I think, or possibly a chef, who was absolutely obsessed with coffee and said, from now on, you're the coffee sommelier. Okay? Your job is to offer people completely different blends of coffee, espresso, whatever coffee you want. We'll buy the machinery, and this will be, one of the best cups of coffee you've ever had. Now, from the peak end rule of Daniel Kahneman,
What's that?
The idea being that how an experience ends has a disproportionate effect on the memory of your experience. So if you listen to a wonderful symphony, but at the end there's a scratch on the record and it gets stuck, your memory will be disproportionately compromised.
Yeah.
And similarly, if you have a great meal, but it ends with shit coffee. And then he went one step further, which is he appointed a beer sommelier. Now, I've noticed this. If you happen not to want to drink wine at a fancy restaurant, you're treated like shit. Because they come in and top up all your friends' fucking glasses. And, ooh, do you want another bottle of this? If you're ordering wine, you're treated like a god. If you order beer, you're basically neglected. Can I have another beer, please, right?
Yeah.
And he actually appointed a guy as the kind of beer sommelier. Then, now, what was fantastic about this was that it must have coincided with that period of extraordinary kind of effusion of brilliant American craft beers. And the beer makers were so bloody chuffed that a really serious restaurant was taking beer seriously. They were basically kind of always delivering bottles of their finest craft double IPAs, not quite for free, but I mean, they were absolutely overrun. Now, funny enough, there is an Indian restaurant somewhere in Smithfield, which I think it closed down probably because of Crossrail, but they had a really serious approach to beer. And it's often totally neglected. And I think, I thought that book, what's his name? Will, can you remember his name? I can't remember his surname. It's definitely called Hospitality Beyond Reason. Fantastic book, by the way. Anybody in the customer service business should read it. And that point of actually saying, okay, where are we falling short? And beer is a fantastic example. Where most great restaurants, I think, fall really, really short.
It's like looking at the problem, back to what we were talking about with James Dyson, looking at the problem from the wrong way round.
Wrong way round, exactly.
And I interviewed Charlie McVeigh. Do you know Charlie McVeigh?
Yeah. And you have to remind me, I know the name.
So he basically took, well, exactly what you're saying, right? So he built a business called, I interviewed him, funnily enough, above a pub, The Ring in Southwark, great pub. Oh, yeah. And he created a business called The Draft House, which he sold to Brewdog. But basically, Brewdog was 2009, Camden Town was 2012. Charlie set this up in 2006 when craft beer wasn't the sort of you know, propulsion it's got now, right? So, but he was like, okay,
And God, does it deserve it? I mean,
God, yeah. So, but he looked at it, and they're like, right, we're gonna put the beer first,
yeah.
and then the food second, right? So they had this whole smorgasbord of different craft beers, which back, you know, this almost coming up 20 years ago, 20 years ago. Everyone's like, what are you doing? He tried to sell Italian food.
Nah.
And it just didn't work. And their first pub was in absolute disarray because they got the bit right about the beers. Almost, he wanted beer, everyone behind the bar to be more of a beer sommelier versus, you know, back in the day, it's like, you know, pour a fucking pint and then here's your packet of scratchings or whatever, right?
Little blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, they were like, yeah.
Supping ale, session ale.
He almost created like the Apple Genius bar. For beer.
But for
right?
booze.
Yeah, for booze, which is amazing. But anyway, then he realised like what actually people want with beer is if you're getting on the sesh, right, you actually just want burgers, salt, fat. And he did that, and then it began to scale. But he'd looked at that problem from the other way around.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Which is that there's a huge explosion in posh Turkish restaurants. And the first rule of being a posh Turkish restaurant is you cannot sell a doner kebab. I don't know why that is. I mean, because I presume that the doner kebab is authentically Turkish. Is it? I mean,
I don't know, that's why I get when I'm pissed.
But it is. I mean, I made a very perverse argument once that said that the doner kebab may be the world's finest food because when your brain is drunk and shorn of all pretension, it's what you really want to eat.
Yeah.
So if we're being intellectually honest, okay, we have to acknowledge that the kebab has some magical property. True also of Indian food and spicy. You heard the thing about Nashville hot chicken, did you? I might have told that story. So there's a place called Prince's Hot Chicken. It was originally called Barbecue and Hot Chicken. And the guy who ran the original restaurant was basically a womanizer and a drunk. And his girlfriend was massively pissed off that he'd been staying out so late, so left him a meal of insanely overspiced chicken for when he got back as revenge. And of course, he got back drunk and thought it was absolutely delicious. And they built the whole restaurant. It still exists, I think. Although, bizarrely, the original restaurant, an Audi 4x4 crashed into it. And I don't think it's reopened since in Nashville. But there are other branches. But the entire premise of the restaurant was built around this thing which was created as a revenge dish. But of course, when you're drunk, that's exactly what you want.
What I find weird is how some cuisines take on more than others. So when I went over to see the Irish guys, right, in Dublin, I was speaking to Lorcan. He's like, mate, there's no curry houses over here. There's like no curry houses in Dublin.
There is one called,
but it's
there's one out by the bay which I went to, which was pretty good. But it's unbelievably. My Irish friends complain that if you go to an Irish curry house, it basically says. Every single dish says very mild, made with potatoes.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know what's going on there.
But then I was in New York about 2 months ago now, actually, and they've got curry house, right? They've got I don't know what the stats are with the population wise, but they've got an Indian population in New York. But then it's
actually the Indian population in the US is comparatively recent. So they,
interesting.
Actually, they tended to start off as software, coders in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
But so the Indian scene is actually okay in the US, or certainly in New York and larger cities. But it was disappointing slightly even in the 1990s in big cities. A place called Tabla in New York. I don't know if it still exists. That was very good. I went to.
But then Korean food over there is huge, and it hasn't really caught on over here.
It will because it's fabulous.
Really? Because have you been to New Malden?
I have. I went on a pilgrimage to New Malden. I've done that twice actually. Every time I'm on the M3 or whatever it is.
It's sacrilege because I think the best Nando's is in New Malden, right? But so what restaurants have you been to in New Malden that are?
I can't remember. I never remember. There's a very good one called Tobang. Which my ultimate favourite is a thing called Dulsot Bibimbap, which is the hot stone bowl, bit of beef, bit of rice, bit of egg, and you effectively mash it all up. It continues to cook within the bowl, and you blast on a load of chili sauce. Weirdly, there's quite a nice one, which has also got a slightly strange name. And which is alongside Charing Cross Station in Villiers Street. It's only a little thing, but you can go and have a really, really good hot noodle soup there. And they also do those corn dogs, which seem to be, a bit of a feature. But to be honest, I mean, I've never really had a bad Korean meal. I'm sure.
How's it different from? Because to be honest, I actually feel bad. I have
two cheeky ones, I'd say. Now I'm going to really, really get people riled here. I think Indian food's better than Chinese. I think Italian food's better than French. I think Korean food's better than Japanese. Okay, and I think Malaysian food's better than Thai. Okay, so now I've only offended about 1.9 billion people with that assertion, but it's not always the better food that wins. Now, I'm totally happy for people. Italian food's better because it's scalable. The French are fine if you're doing a banquet, but they've never really got the snack food thing. In fact, there isn't really a French word for snack. They got croque monsieur and a very limited repertoire, but Italian food is scalable. You can you go and chop up some tomatoes and bang it on top of a bit of stale bread.
I'd actually put Spanish food above French for me personally. I think also this is.
By the way, I mean there's some countries where I have to say I went to Greece in the early 90s and the food was shit. Okay, I mean literally fucking awful. I came from England. Okay? Yeah. And now you go back, it's fantastic. There seem to be countries which have utterly transformed their game. I mean, the UK being one of them, let's be honest.
But I think the way to eat, it's almost, you could apply it across different cuisines, right? So, for example, tapas, right? That way of eating is very different, but it's very, very enjoyable.
You've been to San Sebastian, have you?
I haven't, no.
Pinchos. Oh, that's worth a pilgrimage.
But so then I think a restaurant, which is a genius idea, is just to copy that. So if you had been to San Carlo, they've got one in Manchester, the Cicchettini is Italian tapas and it's fucking amazing. So you get a slice of pizza, you'll get a little spag bowl.
My daughter wanted me to go there. We went to Dishoom. There's another one in terms of favourite restaurants. I don't get to go there very often. It is probably the most expensive Indian restaurant in London, but weirdly, the most expensive Indian restaurant in London is still pretty reasonable compared to the most expensive French restaurant in London. And it's better because it's Indian.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's a thing there I have which is called, crikey. It's called Salou. It's on Kinnerton Street, just off kind of the Knightsbridge underpass, opposite the Berkeley Hotel.
I think we talked about this last time, actually, yeah.
And there's a thing there which is, it's actually unusual. It's a Pakistani restaurant. I think there are other branches. They've got a branch in like New York and Karachi or something. And it's there's a thing there, I've just briefly forgotten what it's called, which is a kind of shredded lamb in a kind of lentil base over which you sprinkle bits of chopped chili and ginger and things. And I'll remember what it's called in a second, but it's utterly, that'd be, I would condemn to death somewhere.
It's
probably Pakistan, since they have them.
But that's so me and
that would be where I'd order my last meal from.
Me and my mate went to a curry house in Balham on Sunday called the Balham Social, and it was actually a really interesting way of eating a curry, right? So we just thought they had a really long starters menu. So we went in there and we were like, I don't want to get, I was pretty hungover. Really didn't want.
Because they need to work out how to scale. I mean, Indian street food.
It was so hot.
Scaling it down. I don't mind the hot.
No, as in the weather was so hot, I didn't want to eat loads of.
It's really hot.
No. I know that. As in, I was so hungover.
My wife used to say when she was pregnant, oh no, you're not supposed to eat spicy food when you're pregnant. I used to say, there are 1.6 billion Indians. Okay? We had twins anyway, so it can't have exactly been that much of a problem.
But the way of eating it, again, back to the way you eat your pizza with knife and fork tastes different. The experience, even though it was the same restaurant, right? The exact same restaurant where I've gone in the winter and...
In really hot... The other weird one, which is totally weird, is what I call the Indian picnic, which is you go and get an Indian takeaway and you actually eat it as a picnic. And eating Indian food out of doors is weird.
Really?
Okay? I can't really... there are a lot of weird things where if you do them out of doors, I'm getting into sex or something, but there are a lot of weird things that if you do them out of doors, it's completely different in that if you rig up your router in the window and you go and work in the garden in the summer, it doesn't really feel like work. It's completely weird. So certain things you can just create a complete sort of contextual shift by just moving outside. And I used to do this. I got one of those sort of, what are they called? Not a range extender. It's like a mesh network. And if you ring up, if you've got BT broadband, by the way, and you ring up and you say, I've got weak coverage in part of the house, or I've got a very big garden, or whatever it is, okay, they'll send you a free little round thing, and you can pop it in the window, which basically means you've got Wi-Fi in the garden.
What I love is those little, and that's why I love restaurants as well. I interviewed a chef called Tommy Banks, who's got a restaurant up in Oldstead, which is above, we'll wrap this up shortly, just above Leeds. And this is a genius piece of alchemy. You walk in, right, and say these are the chairs, right? On every single one, he's just done that. And so you walk into the restaurant, when every chair's not like this, it's like this. And I talked about this.
So they're parallel, but at an angle.
Yeah. And he basically, I don't know where he got the idea from, but he basically had the whole thing of being like open body language.
Yeah.
And I can't describe. You walk into a restaurant like that, and every chair's facing that way. You just suddenly feels, and you cannot. It's like going outside with the router. You can't.
That's a really, really clever thing to do.
Yeah, very clever.
Because it somehow feels welcoming, perhaps, or as if that's a very, very. I mean, also, by the way, I was just talking to the man who's created this thing or co-created this thing called Arcade. There's one at Tottenham Court Road.
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the food court, and you can include Box Park in this, is actually a pretty useful concept, isn't it? Because it's a kind of evolutionary. If you can think of the individual retailers as like genes, or they're units of selection. Okay. And eventually you'll probably end up with a really interesting complementary mix. And you get the flexibility where anybody can eat any food they like, and the coffee's really good because you get it from a specialty coffee place, and the cocktail's really good because you get it from a specialty cocktail place, and everything's really good. So you get gains to specialization, but also gains to scale. So he's also opened a second arcade in Battersea Power Station.
Which is so clever because the food in there is shit.
Oh, is it?
I walked through there because the chocolate company I did a bit of work for was opposite. I was thinking, how the fuck have you built this? And it's basically like the Bental Centre in Kingston with a few poles on it. That's been a bit disparaging.
Have you been to that place in Canary Wharf? Because Roti King.
Yes. Yeah.
Ooh, this is my point about Malaysian food being better than Thai.
Yeah.
Okay.
The nasi goreng. That's amazing.
No, and also they've opened a new thing which is called, is it something Gopal something?
I've been to it in Canary Wharf. You get the roti and dip it in the curry.
Yeah. No, I haven't been there yet, but there's some sort of food court thing that's opened in Canary Wharf, which is the same kind of concept.
My mate lives in Canary Wharf.
What's wonderful about it is it's really, really good for what you might call brandogenesis. Because places, rather like the one in Box Park, which effectively did lots of versions of loaded fries. I don't remember what that's called. But it's a great place to try out concepts. And, in terms of what you might call creating a gateway for food experimentation and the creation of new brands and actually the expansion of existing brands, along with this whole dark kitchens thing, which is, the food thing is you have the dark kitchens, then you have the sort of central kitchens, which supply physical restaurants. The extent to which there's now innovation in the food sector, and of course food trucks, which really interests me because we've got, it's rather annoying in my village in Kent, which is on Mondays, the wood-fired pizza van turns up, and so does a very good place which does Greek souvlaki. And they're both on Mondays, and then, Tuesday to bloody Sunday, we got bugger all, which is a bit silly, but never mind. But what's so interesting about that is I'm absolutely convinced that my kids ate wood-fired pizza from that van one day a week, but they actually ate it much more frequently than they would have done if there'd been a pizzeria at the end of our drive. Because it's the scarcity thing. Well, it's Monday, so if we don't buy it now, we'll have to wait another 7 days. The guy parked somewhere else on Tuesday to Sunday, so you could drive and go and find it, but I'm never going to clue where the hell he is. But those kind of things strike me as just really, really interesting in terms of course, there's been, if you think about it, you won't realise this, I'm 57. Eating out, unless you are pretty rich and or a kind of Londoner, Mancunian, Bristolian, in a big city, eating out was pretty rare in my childhood. I mean, most people did it I'm not including cafes, okay? But eating out in restaurants, getting takeaway food was more common, but it was pretty rare in the 60s and 70s, except in certain sort of, fairly rarefied now, what you see in the United States is they actually spend more money on eating out than they do on eating at home. So at some point there was the singularity, which is where the US started spending more on eating food cooked outside the home than on food cooked inside the home. And so we've got to remember that isn't going to continue forever, by the way. And there's probably going to be a hard rain's going to fall in some of the, it's rather like the food delivery thing, which I always think, ultimately that's a bit like Highlander, there can only be one, that actually it's going to be a kind of fight to the death. Probably, actually, I suppose Just Eat have an advantage because they're not responsible for the delivery, are they? So Just Eat probably has an advantage there. But if you take all those sort of delivery services, it's a natural monopoly, I would argue, and it's, unless you have the network effect, it doesn't really work. And so, I suspect that's a case of, whoever's best capitalized, last man standing. And they're probably, let's be honest, there probably will be tough times ahead for quite a lot of restaurants which rode this wave of, all kinds of factors, of course, typically two salary households both provided the money and the lack of time. It was just socially normalized to an extent because people at university ate out a lot and took their habits with them. But it is interesting. I mean, what's going to happen? Because as Nassim Taleb points out, you mentioned him earlier, the graveyard of failed restaurants is a very silent place. So it's very easy to look at restaurants and go, hey, look, this restaurant business is a complete doddle. Look at all these restaurants, they're all doing well.
Wait, so say that again, the graveyard of...
So the way he puts it is the graveyard of... So there's a huge survivorship bias in our perception of restaurants because by definition, we look at the ones that survive and forget or don't see the ones that failed. And quite often in the location of a successful restaurant, 6 restaurants failed previously. So it's very, very easy to look at the restaurant world and become hugely over-optimistic because you only see the successes because it's rather like that wonderful thing where everybody goes, didn't they build brilliant homes in 18th century America? Because look how good these old houses are. Well, there were a lot of old houses which weren't that good. The reason you don't see them is they basically fell down or rotted or were knocked down. It's only the good ones that survive. And actually finding that formula, I suspect, is bloody difficult. Now, I'll give you an example from my own local town. Just at the right... So there was a restaurant on a hill with bloody awful parking. And it's the worst thing you can be.
Into a bar,
you end up parking down the hill, having to walk uphill. Now, to Londoners, this isn't that weird. What you've got to remember is outside London, you're used to be able to park where you eat, basically. Which is why, I mean, by the way, actually, the food scene outside London is... one of the most extraordinary things. I often talk about things that nobody notices because they happen slowly. Okay, we all talk about things like Brexit because they notionally happen quickly. Okay, but actually, the really important changes happen slowly. And,
back to Ernest Hemingway, he's got a quote which is gradually, then suddenly, which I love.
Someone said that about how you go bankrupt. You go bankrupt in two ways: first slowly, and then and then gradually, and then suddenly. But that's actually a very, very important concept because I think, for example, okay, I'll give you an example of this. No, if you're only 25, you won't realise this. The extraordinary dominance of English as a language, okay, wasn't there in my childhood. You learnt French because the French were next door, and in the age before most people took long-haul flights, okay, you learnt the language of your next-door neighbour, okay? Now, that basically, has totally diminished to a point where if you go to... I met someone the other day who lived in Amsterdam for 11 years, doesn't know a word of Dutch. Right? It takes a bit of a special effort. But I mean, that you couldn't have done that. in the 70s. I mean, you would have got around okay, but I mean, and these things that happen really, really slowly, I think are really important to understand because weirdly they tend not to make the news.
One also is important for people listening to this as founding businesses, right?
Yeah.
Because I think there's this whole, I call this whole idea of...
So one of the point I make, that one of the things that's happened really slowly, but is really, really significant, you have to be 45 to notice it, is that when you went to provincial cities or even and especially provincial towns, okay, from London in 1989, with the possible exception of like an Edinburgh or a Bristol, okay, or Bath, or something, they were shit. And when I say that, I went to Manchester in 1989, okay? Now, my daughter's at Manchester University. I go there. I can see no particular disadvantages living in Manchester versus living in London now, okay? In fact, I get...
Is she living in Fallowfield?
Funny that she was. She started off living in Fallowfield, which she still does. Yeah, you're right, yeah.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting place. It's
and
like
the weirdest thing about Newcastle, where my other daughter is that Jesmond, which is the Knights...
It's so posh.
Newcastle,
Yeah,
is the student quarter. Yeah. It's like, you can't afford to live in Knightsbridge. It's just students there.
And they've got the Jesmond, because I used to go there all the time. So those are two unis that, I went to Manchester and would go up to Newcastle all the time.
Because it's a fantastic city, isn't it?
Both of them are, yeah.
Jish,
and Newcastle, I'd walk, so you're not Fallowfield's like, I mean this in a polite way, it's a bit of a shithole, but that's where all this character is. But it's like, that is
went
not...
for a good Korean there, by the way, really good Korean.
Oh, interesting, yeah. But what I found weird is we're doing the Jesmond Road Mile, which is that mile of where you used to be able to get 3 triples for a fucking £5. And then I was going outside and be like, right, I'm just going to get my pre-drinks. And it's a fucking little Waitrose. And I was going, it's mental. And then it was like everyone who's rich lives in Jesmond, but then so do all the students who are getting off their tits. It's like...
It's completely bizarre. No. And so, I mean, but what is it? I mean, unless you're 40, you don't realize. I always tell this story, so sorry if anyone's heard it before. I remember we were about to miss our last train in a business meeting in Sheffield, and we said to our host, who was from Sheffield, okay,
right,
where's the best place, if we miss our train, where's the best place to stay in Sheffield? He said, Leeds. Now, that, by the way, wasn't entirely a joke, in that there probably wasn't, a nice hotel in Sheffield in 1989. Okay, I'm probably being unfair. There probably was one. Okay, but the extent to which there was a kind of what you might call a provincial city deficit then compared to now has, it's almost disappeared, in that what London really has is, to be honest, an awful lot of redundancy at the price of it being really difficult to move around. Now, literally, if when I was in Manchester in 1989, you kind of couldn't wait to get onto the train back to Euston. And now I actually experience, provincial city envy in a way, because they have all of the goodies of London and the variety at a much lower price in an accessible format. So one of the things I'd hope to see is actually a diminution of this kind of, absurd over concentration of people moving to London, and more interesting businesses, ideas. I'd definitely like to see a sort of centripetal movement.
But also, so Co-op are based up in Manchester.
Centrifugal, sorry.
So Co-op are based. So I host supper clubs for food and drink founders. It's another. There's basically
brilliant.
Yeah, which is epic.
Because the whole Co-op thing was actually created in, where was it?
They're Manchester. They're Manchester.
Yeah.
So one of the things we were talking about, and we're trying to link up, so Hungary would partner with the Co-op, because a lot of London basically gets all the razzle-dazzle, right? But there are some amazing brands based up in Manchester, and actually not just Manchester, the north of England. But there still is this whole thing of like, you've got to be in London to access the Whole Foods, access the Planet Organic. Whereas it's beginning, so I left uni in 2016, so we're, 7 years on? It's now...
Marketers would be astute to notice the fact that where property prices are lower, disposable income is higher. There's, first of all, everybody under the age of about 30 in London who doesn't work in banking is practically bankrupt. Okay, right. The increase you get in your income when the costs of London are factored in by moving to London amounts to like a few quid a year. And actually, the fact that, there are low property price options existing in those places would probably make an astute person. This is one of the reasons I keep arguing about this question of flexible working, because people go, "Oh, I don't want my colleagues to work flexibly." I go, well, that's not the really important part. The really important part is, do you want your customers to be able to work flexibly? Because if they do, they'll have a lot more money to spend on your products. So actually, flexible working, let's say it makes us 4% less productive, but it increases disposable income by 8%. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's a win. You know, and so, free range work as opposed to battery farm work has quite a lot to commend it, not least the fact that
That's such a good way of putting it.
free range. I know. I think there's an inherent bias in that naming, but you know what I mean. It's kind of interesting. But I love that point about slowly and then suddenly, because that's so often how change trends happen. If you look at something like drink driving behaviour or attitudes to same-sex marriage, okay, what basically happens is slowly, then suddenly.
And I hate suddenly. So I've got this thing which is I wrote about this for food and drink brands specifically, right? I did this talk. I do this talk basically about how to sort of be a challenger brand, right? For challenger food and drink brand. And there's this whole obsession in America which has come over from people masturbating over fucking Silicon Valley, which is this whole unicorn, like it basically suddenly. Suddenly. So every food and drink brand founder is seeing brands like Airbnb or Uber or these other unicorns have this like huge exponential growth. So suddenly. Whereas actually food and drink is very different. For my mum to become a user of PayPal, she can just go online and become a user of PayPal in 2 minutes. So actually go and buy...
dispersion of, and what you might call physical and mental distribution of new foodstuffs. So your point about Korean food, for example, is that, I've always had, my father, all credit to him actually, when he was at university, there was one Indian restaurant in the town of about 150,000 people. And he immediately became a complete convert. He thought it was fantastic.
Sorry. What did you say? You said that there was in what?
Well, if you look at the diffusion of food, it looks a bit as though every country has a kind of spicy food. It'd be Indonesian, and France doesn't really have one. I suppose North African. They have North African, stuff. Okay. So, and it tends to be the spicy food you ate as a student, and you take that habit with you. In the US, it's Mexican, okay? And you take that habit with you into later life, perhaps. I don't know. But it's often odd that there's one kind of characteristically kind of slight outlier food in any country's kind of food options. In the UK, it's really been Indian. I had a wonderful friend who said to me, he's got a lot older than me, and he said in the 1960s, he said, there were two questions of any importance. He said, the two questions were Indian or Chinese and Beatles and Stones. And the correct answers were Indian and Stones.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite interesting. But the really interesting thing, I think, is that you're right, because you're expecting this instantaneous adoption of something where you have monumental network effects, okay? Now, obviously, you're going to see very, very rapid uptake of things like ChatGPT, partly out of curiosity, because all you have to do is type something, okay? Now, as you're quite right to say, the hurdles you have to clear to make that Japanese...
or just buying a brand in retail. So it's like, my mum's got to discover that brand, and then also there's a jar
and take the risk,
and
it's £7 in that case, right? That's quite a risk.
Or that chili oil, for example.
Yeah,
that you don't unless you're like a freak, which I could potentially do if I'm drunk. You're not going to neck that whole fucking thing, right? It's going to be in your larder for. If you're a fiend, 2 weeks.
We talk about fast-moving consumer goods, but there are also a lot of things. And Angostura bitters are not a fast-moving good, are they? Okay.
I'm just say this, and I also say you should always say it's actually quite slow-moving consumer goods. And my point is, what I say is, in a world that's obsessed with unicorns and suddenly actually be a donkey and gradually, and then suddenly, and to be honest, it's like the same with this podcast. There was no one listened to it for the first 3 years, whereas now it's beginning to just go like that, right? But
No,
it's,
I mean, interestingly, that point about complete non-linearity of progress in that way, and the fact that there's a kind of, Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, I guess, is a
yeah.
But I'll give you an example. So Madfest is this advertising festival, which is free to attend by invitation.
Did you set that up? Did you set that up?
No. I work with them, but we work with them on Nudgestock, and we partnered with them on Nudgestock, but they set it up.
And
quite a few
Nudgestock
years
is
ago.
just, sorry, because
And Nudgestock is our behavioural science festival, which we bolt onto the tail end of Madfest, which is at the Fluid Brewery.
With you. Yeah.
And every year they send out invitations and 15% of people come, okay? And they've got absolutely hard data showing basically, the uptake rate is about 15%, And of course it operates over 3 days. Mostly people don't go for all 3 days. And suddenly this year, okay, basically there's total mayhem because there are queues all around the block because the take-up rate is 40% or something crazy, right? And what's just happened is that it's crossed that threshold of being a thing, okay, where previously it was, I wonder if I'll go to Madfest, and suddenly it becomes, are you going to Madfest this year? Kind of change, so it goes from a default no to a default yes, as it were, because it's just become a thing.
The other side of that is when, what always interests me is when a restaurant becomes almost a bit passé, or that's what I was saying, or a bit...
Well, Pizza Express is the really interesting one, because there was a Michelin-starred chef who said he thought that Pizza Express...
Marcus Waring.
Yeah.
I think so.
I have to say, I don't go to Pizza Express very often, but I still agree with him, kind of.
So there's that, and if you...
He was widely attacked. Now, there are alternatives. There's a place called the Detroit Pizza Company somewhere in Shoreditch, which makes...
Have you been to Crisp?
No, I've been to pizza. What are they called? Pizza Pilgrims.
Yeah. Have you heard of Crisp?
No, go on, hit me with it. It's somewhere in the East End, isn't it?
No, it's in the, but this, I wrote a piece about this in my newsletter actually, and called Escape the Middle, right? And basically, the middle is every man and his dog has set up a pizza restaurant with hipsters doing Neapolitan pizza in East London. And they've probably got tattoos and they're quite obtuse on Instagram. That's basically the middle, right? This guy sets up a pizza restaurant and he's been obsessed with New York style pizza. Opens a restaurant in a shitty pub in Hammersmith, which serendipitously happened to be near the River Cafe.
Oh,
which meant that the River Cafe chefs went there. So those are the neophiles, the early adopters.
Slightly worrying fact about fine dining is the chefs all go home via KFC, don't they?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you do have to ask some questions about
But this pizza, so when everyone's doing Neapolitan, which is that sort of fluffy dough crust, this guy's commenting, and it's Roman style, so it's just the crisp. And anyway, so, and it's in a pub, so you go in and it's like a Fulham Football Club pub. So it's lots of old geezers, drinking Guinness, shouting and swearing at the TV. You have to order through things. So everything about this doesn't make sense. There's no cool hipster, there's no cool Instagram, well, there is now an Instagram following. But when it initially started, it was like, what is this place? But yeah, back to the what I was going to say is, when does something become not cool?
Because Marcus Waring said the American hot was basically his favourite pizza.
With extra chilies, yeah.
Which is funny enough what I have.
Yeah.
I did occasionally
Do you get
dabble with the
Rikito or...
Crikey, it's a while since I've been, about a year since I've been. He has the Romana, doesn't he? I think the Romana base, American hot, extra chili.
The other base is you get that and you just feel like you've been short, even though it's the same amount of dough.
Yeah,
you get it, and it's back to the psychophysics thing. You're getting the same amount of dough, but
everyone was convinced Pizza Express pizzas had gotten smaller, which wasn't true. They claimed because they've got the original kind of dies from the. That may just be because other people's pizzas were getting bigger, and therefore by comparison, you see, because Domino's and other people started doing these kind of ginormous things. By comparison, Pizza Express pizzas looked smaller than they did when they were surprisingly big when they first came out, I suspect. But that's an interesting case where there's genuinely nothing to dislike about it. It's really rather a wonderful place. And I hope we're not becoming like America, where what matters about a restaurant isn't how good the food is, but how happening it is. And I remember I was in New York and I was going to some restaurant, which was bloody good. Someone said, oh, that's a bit last year. And I kind of go, as a Brit, my question about a restaurant is what's the food like? What's the ambience like? Not how hard it is to get in.
But one of the things that baffles me is how a brand stays relevant. So like, you know, Gales, for example, I think Gales is amazing. That bakery was cool, there's a guy taught me something, which is scale can sometimes kill magic, right? So when a place
I worry about it with Five Guys, because if Five Guys goes from being a treat to a staple, okay, is that a problem? In other words, can Five Guys become, in other words, the victim of its ubiquity? And I'd worry about that genuinely. Scale kills magic is a very good...
Oh, yes, but then there's a quote which I'm trying to by Ray Kroc from McDonald's, which is when you're... What does he say? Are you green and growing, or are you ripe and rotting?
Got it.
Which is basically when you get to that point where with Madfest you cross that chasm where you're a thing. If you don't reinvent yourself, you're no longer the thing. So I'm trying to think of an example. I won't give names, but there's chicken joint places. There is GBK, which I know Adam, the co-founder of that, and so he'll be fine me saying this. That was a super hipster cool place back in 2010s, 11s. Suddenly it gets to 80 sites and it's no longer cool. Do you see what I mean? As in it's too obvious. It's not the thing. And I always think, how do brands get big but stay the thing? Do you know what I mean? It's like, how do you stay...
You occasionally get that regional thing like Whataburger, don't you, in Texas. And there's a thing called, I think it's Blake Burger in New Mexico. And of course, so you've got the regional restriction, which is in and out as well, won't...
That's true, yeah.
In and out won't... They'll open in Arizona, New Mexico and California, but if they can't get the beef there in a day or something, they won't buy it. So they've limited their expansion.
They opened a Shake Shack in Clapham, and I drove past it, and my heart sort of melted a bit. I was like, why does that happen? Do you know? I should be happier. Like, when it was in Covent Garden, there's only one Shake Shack.
Do you know the funnier story, which is that brand which really appealed to people who wanted to be old Etonians but weren't? What was it called? You know the brand, clothing brand.
Old Etonians.
It was
Jack Wills.
Yeah.
Now,
apparently, right, this is a wonderful thing. It's a bit like Henry James's thing, short story, The Real Thing, okay, which is that they opened a Jack Wills on Eton High Street and were so convinced that the demand would be insane that they actually employed a bouncer for the opening day or security.
Oh, God. Yeah.
And nobody showed up.
yeah.
Because it's a little like, I suppose it's a little like the weirdness of British people buying Ralph Lauren, okay, which is you're having your own culture sold back to you. Yeah, it's a bit kind of, there's a little bit of that which I kind of go, I'm okay with this, but it's a bit kind of, but I mean, I think that the ubiquity kills magic thing is a really interesting question because, Dishoom agonize before they open a new,
Well, so Dishoom do it well because they create a story for each.
And each one has a backstory, which is wonderful,
Would you be able, I'd love to get them on. Would you be able to ask?
Cavi, I'll talk to him. Of course, he'd be delighted. He's a lovely...
Yeah. So because I think they're the prime example of do it well, whereby I went to the one in Manchester... And
I'll be there.
The story was they're the master of it, how you scale and keep magic. Because they're actually
right, the Manchester one was supposedly founded by a bit of a rogue, wasn't it? A guy who'd been a smuggler.
Yeah, well, each one has a story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But what that does is we're back to Ray Kroc's quote, which is, are you green and growing or ripe and rotting? Because if they were to carbon copy each one, they'd be ripe and rotting. But by having the story, they're reinventing. They
managed to create an extraordinary thing, which is kind of like there's a constant leitmotif to the thing.
Leitmotif.
But with enough... It's variations on a theme. So the basic authentic theme remains constant, but each restaurant is distinctive enough. It's not. I understand that apparently every single Weatherspoons has a different carpet. I didn't know that. Okay, but they take that much further, so that everyone is distinctive. It's also true to the architecture in which it finds itself to some extent, and by creating this backstory, there's a kind of authenticity to it, but also a difference. Now, interestingly, with Five Guys, I don't know the answer to that question. In other words, is this a food that has to be consumed occasionally in order to be meaningful?
Well, What? So you know that top jaw thing, which did the interview with Marcus Waring.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get them on this podcast actually, but they go around and they've if you want a good series, they go around to every top chef and ask them, what's your best pizza? What's your best burger? What's your best whatever, right? What's London's worst tourist trap? And everyone says fucking M&M World. And the resounding thing from all chefs is that Five Guys is their like hidden gem. And it's like Michelin star chef saying...
No. I mean, funnily enough, the guys at KFC are huge admirers of Five Guys, and what they've done is very, very interesting. So, as I said, they went to this place, Thrashers, I think it's called, in Ocean City, Maryland, to, perfect the fries. And they started off with a food first, price later. And then I think they came up with this really cunning thing, which is they have two signature items, the burger and the shake, which are really expensive. Everything else is comparatively, the extra scoop of fries, the free peanuts, the unlimited drinks. Everything else is comparatively generous. And so you feel you're paying for where it makes a difference and not paying for the things where it doesn't. And consequently, they managed to actually obtain, when you think about it, you're in an environment which isn't much fancier than a McDonald's. They had piles of potatoes, which send an interesting signal. I would totally agree with that assessment. So pretty much every chef will admit to a secret Five Guys. Yeah. And I must admit that now what I have, and by the way, the toppings are free. So that's a really interesting detail. Everybody else charges toppings. You pay for the bacon and the cheese, but all the other things, which I have a mixture of jalapenos, onions, and HP sauce, by the way. I think I have something else as well.
There should be a Challenger brand HP sauce. Actually, there's a brand that there's a brand called Sauce Shop who've been on this podcast. Do fucking good. They do like they do a Scotch bonnet chili jam with a Michelin star chef. You're gonna have to run this.
I'm gonna have to run in about 5 minutes.
Yeah. But they also did a thing called FU sauce, which was fry up sauce, which was a mix of brown sauce and ketchup and vodka.
What?
And it was. Honestly,
brilliant!
It was fucking incredible. Because I think it was a limited run, but it was called Sauce Shop.
What else? Yeah, there are. Interesting expansion in Turkish food. That's undoubtedly a big thing.
Yeah.
Another weird thing is I want to know what's happened to men's hairdressing, which is all the Turkish men must be looking pretty damn scruffy because as far as I can see, every barber in Turkey seems to have moved to the UK. That seems to have happened again in sort of 5 years. But the Turkish barber thing is fascinating, particularly if you get the methylated spirit flicked in your ears. Now, that's something you never would have asked for, isn't it? Right? It's one of those gratuitous things that no customer in market research would ever say, I'm quite happy with my existing hairdresser. I just wish he'd flick burning methylated spirits into my eardrums. Okay? That would never happen. But when it happens, it's kind of brilliant. And so, I effectively, all this, this is a good way to end. I think it's Kumal Galhotra, the head of Ford North America, says that car making is 100,000 rational decisions in search of one emotional decision. That you can get everything right about the powertrain and the this and that and the other, but if people fundamentally don't want to buy the car, it's all a total waste of time.
I love that.
And there's something about the restaurant business where, in a way, I suspect, you've got to add actually a completely bullshit-free restaurant. If you don't have the push for champagne button, you don't have the... If you don't have one singular kind of little standout little mental burr, maybe you're missing something.
Rory, delight as always. I think we could go on.
Always happy to come back. This is an absolute joy.
Yeah, it's my favourite thing to talk about, and you're one of my favourite people to talk about it with. So thank you so much.